you know yourself, he's doing what we're doing here and what we're supposed to be doing everywhere. And it's something he's attending to business, our business. And there's a lot of business to attend to, really.
Yes, sir.
When you think of it, that more and more we are amassing volumes of information, lots and lots of information. And it's hardly imaginable that this information has been there. And yet we were kept away from that information. Now that there has been what you would call a splurge of research, and the more we learn, the more we dig, the more we get, is the more we want. And so it should be, because our history and the things concerning us must be a long one, especially since we were the first on this planet. So we must have a lot of things. And it's the fact that there is so much to do, so much to say, so much to unravel, that's really been the truth that frightens other people.
Right.
And that is why great attempts, tremendous attempts, even genocide is being made to keep that information away. It should not surprise any of us in the struggle. That's why they attacked Dr. Jeffries, Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, Shasi McIntyre. Everybody is being attacked everywhere. Even the few European quote-unquote scholars who speak the truth, and they find themselves doing that, even they are attacked. And you see, what the people who attack don't seem to understand, it's the more they attacked, the more we will know, and people are knowing that this is the truth that they're attacking. And I have no worries and no fears about that, and I'm sure you don't, about the end result. Because everywhere you hear the same stories, that now in schools in Louisiana, in schools in Illinois, in schools in England, they are incorporating this information. Books are being used with this information. So it's a matter of time before everywhere you'll find that part of the education of our people. And indeed, they themselves will come into it and be educated. Not that I care two hoots whether they're educated or not, but and I'm sure the same applies to you. But they are going to be able to see these things, and their children will see this thing as it is, and not follow in the sort of blind, ignorant path of their parents. And that path has been a blind, ignorant path, because there is absolutely, I have tried my best, and I'm sure the same thing you will say. I do not find anything, any reason at all for racism. I cannot find it anywhere. Not that I want anybody to love me from their part. They don't love me. That's not their love that I'm after, neither is the love that you are after. But I'm saying, you have to be either, dumb or wicked or both to be a racist. Let me use an example for you. There is an English scholar. He is an elder. His name is Dr. Hugh Trevor Roper. And this man is considered one of the great scholars of the world, as far as they're concerned. He can write histories of Europe, of Britain. He can write about the Second World War. He can write about their great prime ministers and other people, their great queens and all of that. He can write these, what you call, these august volumes about these people. And yet, when it comes to Africa, he can be so stupid. And I use the word stupid, but I'll have to change this word in a minute. Because when I tell you, the man could write in a book that Africans have no history, except the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness. And darkness is not a fit subject for history. Now, would you credit any man, any scholar to write this kind of thing? But he did. And it's published in a book that was published in 1967. It is not ignorance, really. It's got to be something else. So we can only attribute that to arrogance, white supremacy, racism. That's all we can say. So what I am saying is when at that level, and he's not singular there, when he says this kind of thing, you know for yourself that there are many, many, many scholars like him who are saying the same thing. If that were not the case, we would not be having this problem that we're having in education today. Because what they are saying to me and to you is a gross insult to our intelligence. You are trying to tell the children, your children who go to your schools to be miseducated, you are telling them, and you are telling the world in your newspapers, your rags you call newspapers, your television screens, you are telling the world that all this thing about Africans is not true. You are wanting the world to believe lies. How can you have respect for anyone who does this? You cannot have respect for their system, for their religion, for anything. I say this blankly because they are trying to tell a lie. They're telling this lie and hanging on to the lie. For what reason? For racism? All right. So what they are in fact saying is that no matter whether it is the truth written or not, African peoples are inferior. They're not like us. And so we are not like them really. We're not like us. And so consequently, we cannot accept them in the world of equality. This is precisely what they're saying. How can you believe their laws? How can you have any faith or any belief in their religion? I'm saying, Malcolm was saying the same thing. I'm not singular in that respect. You have to ignore these people totally. And I mean totally. We have to live as we see ourselves. And we have to go our own way. You can live among people, but not be like them. It doesn't mean that you have to follow. No, really, let us look at this thing before I get into this, what I'm going to say. It all hinges together. What really have they done on planet Earth that is beneficial to us, really? The Caribs were living before they were there. The Caribs they had known what to do with food. They had known what to do with living, making houses, building houses. Up to now, they're building. If the houses built like the Caribs and the Taínos and the Arawaks build their houses in the Caribbean, made out of the hands of the people, not belonging to any union, not being skilled in any kind of European building architecture. They build houses where hurricanes cannot even throw the roof off. There's a proof of that in the island of Dominica at the moment. The Carib, they call them cabes, round houses. They had the most ferocious hurricane in 1979, Hurricane David. It ripped off the roof and threw buildings down that had been built by American architects and contractors and so on. The ones that were built by the Caribs and the Arawaks remained. The way they built the roofs, nothing can remove them. These are people you call cannibals, you call uncivilized. What I'm trying to say to you, we haven't profited. Had the Incas been left on their own, had the Aztecs been left on their own, we do not know where they would have reached. Had Africans been left to their own devices, I am certain, like you are, we would not be in this position today. The building of cars, if we want to look at this, the building of airplanes, these things would have come. It's not only one set of people, because all the knowledge, the theoretical knowledge that they took in science and mathematics to do that, we had already had it, and it is from Africans they took it.
That's right.
We would have interpreted it the same way. Proof of the pudding is the kind of buildings that were built in Kemet and other places long before Europe knew anything. They had little square boxes, little holes for the chimney to go up, where the horses, the stables for the horses of the Moors were superior in comfort and architecture than their own, and the house of princes and kings in France and in England and elsewhere. So we have to understand that. The book that they just had, this brother was showing the book, the Iceman Inheritance, that was brought out again, and with the introduction by Dr. Clark. The Iceman Inheritance, one of their own scholars tells you straight, the trouble with the world is the white man. The man is right, because he has done absolutely nothing to improve the quality of life. Building a car is not improving the quality of life, you know. Having a condo is not improving the quality. You know what would improve it? If he could find cures for all those diseases he brought from his lab and brought them to our people. That is what would be something. You cannot cure a common cold. He's brought AIDS into the world from his lab through his wickedness. And now he cannot find a cure. Some man is saying, some scientist was saying on the television yesterday, oh, in the next 8 years, they think they'll have a vaccine. 8 years? You can't wait for 8 years. You want now. You're talking about now. This is what you're talking about, not 8 years. Arthur Ashe isn't talking about no 8 years. He's talking about now. Poor brother. And I'm saying, these are the things we want to talk about. The fact they're bragging in figures that tuberculosis has come up, has increased, and now it is an epidemic among people. In this country, that's supposed to be whatever it's supposed to be, I'm not even going to mention it's supposed to be this, to be that, to tell me that diseases that had been stopped years ago are coming back again. Well, let me tell you this. Infant mortality, even in some of the Caribbean islands, is 10 times lower. They just had a report than it is here, right here. And it's not the fault of our mothers and so on. It is the fault of the government. Black people in the Caribbean now, like black people are here, they're living, their life expectancy is higher than white people, white men here at the moment. Because up to now, they haven't fallen victim to all the sins of North America, as Dr. Eric Williams once called them. So I'm saying, we do not have to look for salvation from them. Salvation rests with us. Redemption is with us. Bob Marley said it and he was right. It is with us. So when people turn around and say about the world and Europe and what they're doing, let us look at it this way. It is not by chance that they're making a big fuss of this 500th anniversary of all the nastiness that was done to indigenous people. Coinciding with this 500 years, when the world was expanded, there was a global expansion of the world by Europe. And as one Jesuit priest said, they left Spain poor, Columbus and the others, and they went back with wealth. Obviously, they got the wealth somewhere. They didn't get it in the middle of the Atlantic. They got it where this man lost himself and found himself. That's where they got it. And they built Europe from this wealth. Their industrial and scientific development and revolution took place on this wealth. It is not by chance, look at it, that this time around now, Europe is closing ranks to become one big white family. The European Economic Community. They didn't say no black economic community, the European Economic Community. They have closed ranks. To do what again? It means if they have the European Economic Community, who are the ones they're going to look at to exploit? Non-Europeans in the world. That's who they're looking at. I hope the Asians, the Chinese are smart enough to be doing their own things. The Indians are smart enough to be doing their own things. The Japanese, if they don't want to be honorable white men, are doing their own things. And more than ever, we must do our own thing. Because at the moment, if we insist, like they insisted before, the colonized countries, of being accepted in any European Economic Community, we are going to be still the beggars that we were hundreds of years ago. We have to have our own agenda. Do not say it cannot be done. It can be done. They like to say in a disparaging way that Africa is underdeveloped. I'm not ashamed to hear that. I only say that these men should have been killed who came there and raped Africa. They should have killed every one of them. And they wouldn't be saying that. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. But Africa is still there. African peoples have the necessary brains wherever African peoples are. They're inventive, they're creative, and they have the necessary vision to be able to do things. But we must do things together. And when we look at it that way, we will understand that it is then and only then we will walk as we want to walk in the world. We don't want to put hands and hug hands and kiss with these people. We don't. But we want them to be in a position where they cannot harm our children and our children's children, and they cannot harm us. They cannot harm Japan today. They are now saying if Japan pulls out in certain things, the recession is going to be even worse if Japan. So they were saying it on some discussion they had on television last night. They're going to be worse if Japan. Can you imagine that? It's a hell of a thing to say. Japan, they gave it a whipping 45 years ago. They dropped bombs, atomic bombs on the country, and now they're depending on those people to get them out of the soup. We must be in a position where they cannot touch us, where they can't put. They say that, all right, we are all over the world. The Japanese are all over the world. The Chinese are everywhere. But still, they have a country that they respect and they love. You go down to Broadway there on 100th Street, and you'll see the amount of Chinese restaurants that are there, or Korean or whatever. You notice that. And you see another thing you notice when you look at those places. You know what you notice? I don't see one African waitress in there. Not one. But they have brothers and sisters that go in there and eat. And even eat with chopsticks, you know. I tried eating with chopstick a few times and I thought my mouth was down here, you know. Couldn't get it up. No, but I'm serious. The Chinese are everywhere in the world. The Koreans or whatever, they're all over the world. So don't say that these people don't have, they have a base that they can respect. Whatever we say Africa is a base. It's still a base for us. In the same way, Israel, that was found only a few 40 years ago, is a base from every little man that's over here now, people that are in here and so on, all these Jewish professors and so on. We have a base. And I'm saying it is when this base can become a serious continent where development, future scientific and other development comes from. That is when we don't have to ask for respect. We will get it. They won't treat us the way they treat us today. They'll treat us differently. You know why? A sister in my class this morning said something, and she was right. It's a thing that I say all the time. Van Sertima says it, and it is true. But for some reason, I don't think our people seem to be getting it as deeply and as profoundly as it should. And it is this. Europeans do not, they tell you about prehistoric times. When they're talking about prehistoric, it means what they're trying to say, times before history mattered, or before there was history. They like to talk about Africa in prehistoric times. In other words, that in itself is denying Africa a history. There's no prehistoric time. History is history, whether it begins in the year 1 or it begins in the year 1 million. It is still history. But they like to do that. But you see, when you look at prehistoric times, there is nothing as far as they're concerned. We know differently. But what they are trying to show is there's a great big vast emptiness of years there. Since, as they say, Africans produced nothing, did nothing, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. Where do they begin to give Africa a history now? You watch that well. The slave trade and slavery. That is where they begin. My sisters and brothers, they will never begin anywhere else but there. And in beginning there, what does it tell us? It tells us many things. We are inferior to them because we were enslaved. We did nothing. We were quote unquote lazy buffoons. It's going to bring that. We had to depend on them for food, for everything. They were the ones that were dishing it out, as bad as it was. They were the ones that were whipping us. They were the ones that were burning us at fires. They were the ones that were chopping our legs off. When you have 400-500 years of that, you tell me any race, that race that is doing that is going to respect the other one? No. Van Sertima says, and those words always stick in my mind. He says, they look at us as stunned survivors who are scratching and groping on the periphery of civilization. And in fact, still depending on the strong civilization of the West to give us life and the necessities that go with life. I refuse to accept that. It places a permanent inferiority on us. We cannot accept it. That is not where our history began. But in their eyes, they will always say, have you noticed something? You remember when in the early stages when they were getting at Dr. Jeffries' neck, they were always saying, asking him one time, Dr. Jeffries, are you saying that because black people have melanin, they're superior to whites? Have you noticed how often they were on about that? You know why they weren't often about that? In their own minds, they have this superiority thing. And who are we to say we're superior to people who used to kick our behinds and burn us at the stake? Who are we? That's what's going on in their mind. Because if you have superiority, you've got to have inferiority to go with it. This is what they're intimating. You notice they were paranoid with that question, if you remember. Every time it came up, every article they wrote, they were on about that. It means in their minds. Francis Cresswell Singh has told us so. They have this white supremacy that you can't, it's worse than AIDS, it's worse than cancer for them. They'll never get it out. Their children can be born tomorrow, the day after, they'll still have it. They don't even have to teach their children. The children will get it like they get a natural thing in them. And I'm saying, at that level, we cannot in any way have any dealings. I'm not saying, in the same way, if we have to develop and build Africa and build ourselves, we can use their labor in the same way they used our labor when they were building their world. There's nothing wrong in using it, but make sure that they are the laborers, and that's all they're going to stay. They don't have any control over what is built, over Africa or anything. They must have absolutely no control whatsoever. There is no African country with a control in Europe or in North America. Why should they have control in Ghana, in Nigeria, and other places? Why? They shouldn't. We are old enough and mature enough to stop that. Our leaders are. So what I'm trying to show is the fact that it is this kind of, no matter what you do, you just have to ignore completely their thinking, and we have to go about our own thing and do it in whatever way or in all ways possible. Whatever is necessary, we have to do it. And we cannot exclude anything. I want to go back. If you read the papers, they like to talk, they love to talk about the countries, the underdeveloped countries. Mm-hmm. It's underdeveloped and developed. That's all they can say. Right. Mm-hmm. In this world that is a long time been there, we shouldn't have been talking about that kind of thing. They were the ones that control all the resources of the world, and they're going to go on and still make it that they're going to control the world. You look at the behavior of the United States, and you can see that. The United States is an international cop. The United States believes in having an empire around it. This hemisphere, it said so, and it behaved in that fashion. The United States is always looking for somewhere to invade, somewhere that is weak in military might. They're talking about Haiti. My suggestion to my Haitian brothers is don't allow America to invade Haiti. They're going to do much worse than the generals of today. If you have to get rid of those generals, do it yourself. I can understand you inviting African governments or soldiers to come there, but not from North America or not from England. Because America was in Haiti before, in 1915. America went down there, and they had a job to get them out in 1924. They had to fight to get them out. They have gone to Grenada. You see the results. Nothing has changed. They've gone to Panama to take out one man. And if that man is guilty, most of the men in the cabinet of Reagan are guilty, including Reagan himself. And they're making they're making a monster of Noriega. Look at what they've done to this great big American patriot. What's his name? That colonel, whatever his name was. North. And North, who was going to make concentration camps for black people here in America. They're still on to that. And so I'm saying, you cannot take them seriously. What they did to Noriega, somebody said, one of the attorneys in the case after, the press is always pushing microphones in people's mouths at times like that. Well, he said that many people should not be talking and be glad and happy of what happened to Noriega, because they themselves can find themselves in that same boat. It means America can go to any country, attack the country, kill the people to take one man out to bring them here. And also he said, America has never had any respect for international law. Never. But they're the first ones to talk about other people. The This is a country that's the most hypocritical country in the world. There's no other hypocrites that can match these people in their supreme hypocrisy. Especially with that snotty-looking bushman, you know. I say, you know, you never know. Something has got to happen to these people. Something's got to happen. You cannot get away with evil and preach how it's bad to commit sin on a Sunday. You can't do that. And you committing evil all the time. Something has got to happen. And I hope the African gods are listening to me. I hope that something will happen. And we have to set it in motion to happen. Because, you know, they went to Libya. They killed Gaddafi's daughter. Ain't nobody has said a thing. They could have killed, you know, an animal on the desert. As far as they... Can you imagine what would happen if that thieving son of his in SNL had an accident? They'd be screaming and crying all over the television sets. These hypocrites. You know, these anchormen and anchorwomen. They would be crying about it. But they could do what they want. And the other thing, to look the other day, I know many, many people who were unhappy that the PLO chief Arafat did not die in that thing. The amount of people who were regretting that he didn't die, you know. And so this is what I'm saying. One has to understand these things. When I talk, I'm talking in this way. I remember during the war, the Second World War in England. And one of the things that in uniform, I used to hear them saying a lot when we were being briefed by intelligence and so on. They were saying, Goebbels is not telling a lie. Goebbels is not preaching, is not giving out propaganda. Because the bigger the lie, the more effective it is. And Goebbels was saying, I was listening, you listen to some of the things the guy was saying, you know, you couldn't believe it. He was saying the real things he was talking about, the royalty and so on. The British were even prepared to say they understand that because our propaganda is just as bad and just as wicked as his propaganda. It gave me an insight into Europeans when it comes to speaking the truth. To save their skin, they will never speak the truth. Never, never, never. Look at their legal injustice laws they have here. You know, look at them well and see. If you can tell me, after so many hundreds of years, that this is a kind of injustice that can be pushed against people. This cannot be a country, except it's a country, as Frederick Douglass said, of savages. The things they do would put beasts to shame. You remember Frederick Douglass's great speech. He was right. He said it, in 1852 he said it. What he said in 1852 is relevant today with them. They haven't changed one bit. I don't know what a lot of our people, as Dr. J would call them, our Negro achievers are waiting for. If they're waiting for change, I don't know if that's what they're waiting for. I know we in here are not waiting for that. But the thing is this, how much more you have to take. We do not look at the things that happen and analyze them properly. Look at, as I said 500 years ago, they're celebrating this great big, the expansion of the globe for the benefit of Europe when the modern world started, as they themselves call it. It started then because they began to do wholesale robbing and killing at that time. But look at what is happening. They're closing the world into one family, a white family. To do what? To control the world. To control the world. They're worrying a lot about the weapons in Russia. 2, 3 little machines, missiles, where have they gone to? They bothered about it because they think it may have gone to Libya, It may have gone somewhere else, and so they're worrying about it. America is not saying what it's doing with its missiles. America is not saying, and whatever they say that they're doing, I don't believe them. And we should not believe them. So what it means, Russia ain't nothing now, as you know. Russia ain't nothing. So it means Russia is dismantled, demoted, everything. And so consequently, the one strong country in the world will be this one, aided and abetted by a Europe that is all close together. But they're going to have a lot of trouble to get Europe together. You know why? Because these same countries have fought against each other too long and too many times for them to just get together like that. Leave them alone in their soup. Let them see what will happen to them. But when they do that, what I'm saying is the African world and the Asian world has to look at this thing, what is happening. It's serious. It's very, very serious. Because we cannot allow this 500 years to go by that they're celebrating and not have our own agenda really fixed for what we want to do, what we have to do, what is necessary to do. And I say this, you know, I say this, that I am not one prepared to look past and shut my eyes to the question of armed resistance. I'm not prepared to close my eyes to that. Mandela is not prepared. His wife is not prepared to close her eyes to that. She's not. The people who had the American independence were not prepared to close their eyes to that. You cannot close your eyes to that. If it comes, it has to come, it has to come. Death is there. If it has to come, it has to come. Or as it will come. But whatever way, it has to come. So I'm saying, you will not be able to remove those people. There are many things that have to be done. Economically, we have to be able to attack them where it's going to hurt them and look at other things as well. Look how they are afraid of armed resistance. Watch this. All of us in here remember, I'm sure, do you remember when the Cuban troops were in Angola and Guinea-Bissau? You know what South Africa said? Get the Cuban troops away so we can negotiate. Why do you think they wanted the Cuban troops to go? Because the Cuban troops were cutting their behind. That's why we're beating the hell out of them. That's why they didn't want them there. They were a match for the South African troops. They couldn't match them. They were playing with Fidel's men, but they were playing with the wrong men. Because these were men that could fight the back of them and beat them at it. And anyhow, the Cuban troops went on. But in a sense, we have to have the philosophy of Fidel Castro. When they were asked why they're sending troops to Africa, Fidel said that Cuba is 99% African and it has a right there. The troops have a right there. But I think it's a cheek to ask, why should Cubans send troops there? These people who are from Europe send troops there for hundreds of years. What am I hearing? So it is good for them to do that and not good for the other side to do it. We drink this thing. Our politicians who are supposed to be educated in their universities eat, drink, and sleep this kind of garbage. And we can't look to our politicians, to them to do anything. Not at all, because there's not, I see that Reverend Allen is saying now that there's some people from inside who are our leaders. Let them fight with the way they can fight inside. But those outside have another way to fight. Maybe that's true. But those inside, what I would like to tell Reverend Allen, those inside ain't fighting at all. They ain't fighting at all. They're fighting for increase of money, or they're fighting to looking for a scam. This is what they're fighting for. It is those outside that's going to shake the apple tree for the apples to fall. The ones outside, it has always shown to be the same thing. And so, when Reverend Al gets inside there, he's going to have a rough time. I hope he does get it, but he's going to have a rough time. But I know if he takes up the stand, that Adam Clayton Powell takes the stand, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And I have no reason to doubt that he'll take that stand. But I'm saying, you have to take up that stand. You cannot go in there, take up the stand of our Yamaka mayor, you can't take up his stand. And so consequently, what I want to say is the mentality, the attitude of Europeans will never undergo a change. I'll tell you why. Let us look at, as long as I can remember, and perhaps you can remember, they've always been talking about the third world. Now, the third world, you would imagine there's only one world. But the third world is an economic, political, racial, and educational phrase brought up by them, made by them. Again, the same thing Francis Cresswell was saying, white supremacy. The third world means there is a part of the world that's inferior to the first world. If there's a third world, there's got to be a first world. They don't have to say who's the first world because they take it for granted that everybody knows that Europe and North America is the third world. And all the white dominions, Australia, etc., New Zealand, Canada, that's the third world. Fine. The second world was a world that's not as strong. It was a world that was socialist. Now, it doesn't exist in their minds, as far as they think that Marxism has gone to hell and it's not there anymore. So if there's a third world, it is a creation by the West, by the first world. We have to stop talking in terms of a third world. And I have done a study of this thing, and what I'm going to say is this, that the third world in my eyes and in your eyes does not exist as far as I'm concerned. It does not exist. Let me illustrate it this way. What I want to say that this third world, you and I cannot defend a third world. It does not deserve a defense. If you are defending the third world, you are defending a guilty world, a world guilty of keeping itself in underdevelopment and poverty. You are not looking at the causes of the underdevelopment, the causes of the poverty. You are blaming the peoples of the third world. When they say that, what they are trying to say is all that I have gone before and reiterated to you is that we are inferior and we do not have the capacity, the mental and the intellectual capacities to be a first world. And in any case, to be a first world means that you have to model yourself on their premise. I am not prepared to model myself on them. Neither should any one of us in here. If we are creating a world, let us create an African world. That's what we should be about. Not a first world. It will automatically be a first world. And therein is going to lie a lot of problems with them, not with us. So I'm saying that, let me put this in your mind. What is this third world anyway? And where is the third world? I mean, where does it begin? Where does it start? Where is it at all? If we say third world, we are not talking about regions. We're talking about people who happen to live in regions. Now, all right, what about these people who come? Say, like, for instance, if we call Jamaica a third world country, it doesn't mean we are meaning not Jamaica, you know. We're calling Jamaicans third world people. What about Jamaicans that are here? What about Jamaicans that are in England, Jamaicans that are everywhere? It's the same thing with Puerto Rico and all these countries that we could lump together as third world. Their peoples are all over the world. So in other words, if you're talking about a third world, this third world is scattered everywhere, even in the first world, if you have to look at it that way. And you're looking at the first world as the rich countries. How many countries of Europe really that you could call first world? You can't. What new experiments, new inventions have they brought about? Going to space? What has that going to space done? Can you tell me for the benefit of mankind yet, or the world of humankind? I haven't seen it yet. Maybe, I don't know, but I doubt it. I doubt it. There's billions and billions of dollars that are spent. So let us put it this way. And if we accept, the fact is that I'm establishing in my thing that the third world, as a world apart, as a world of peoples, does not exist. It doesn't. What exists are countries in which African peoples, Asian peoples, and so on lived that were colonized by imperialist powers for their own benefit. And the creation of these colonies was a deliberate creation by Europe, or by, quote unquote, the first world. The first world came into being at the time of Columbus. Their concept of a first world, when they began to take lands and use all the lands. Now, when you talk about a third world, what is it? What are we talking? We're talking about politics. We're talking about economics, and we're talking about military affairs. Now, we're talking about, the main thing we're talking about is domination. If we're talking of dominance, as they like to use in terms of the third world, politics. Who controlled the politics of these countries up until about 40 years ago? Europe, Britain, North America. Who controlled the economics? By force of arms, these same countries, to build their own. So the third world in there is a creation, again, not of the people, but of the dominating people of the first world, or the quote, their world, that were there. And it was not something, the third world was not something that was accepted openly, and we sat down and did nothing about it. Because from the time Europe entered into Africa, the Caribbean and elsewhere, people have been fighting to get away. There's been struggles all the time. Don't worry about what they say about the abolitionists. Africans have been fighting for their liberation from the beginning, from the word go. They were fighting from the time they were leaving the coast of Africa right up until today. They were fighting for their liberation. So in other words, they were not prepared to accept, in a general rule, this question of dominance. They accepted it because in the final analysis, when government could not succeed in stopping them, they used what they themselves, a phrase they dug up called gunboat diplomacy. In other words, they began to use arms to be able to control the people. When Britain wants to control some riot or something in the Caribbean, they send troops. America does the same thing. So in other words, what they want to keep a permanent situation, a third world situation that they created, leave it in existence. There was absolutely no reason why America should have invaded Grenada. When, during that time, the IMF conducted a survey of these islands in the Eastern Caribbean, and do you know what the IMF report is there? The IMF report said that of all the countries, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Dominica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, of all these countries, that's in 1983 when the assassination came about, the one country that was showing any visible progress was Grenada, under Maurice Bishop. Unemployment was cut down from 34% right down to 14%. There was free schooling from kindergarten all the way up. Free meals for children. Universities people could go to. They were self-help. They were opening markets with Cuba, with China, with other places. Grenada was opening markets with countries that they had never had business with. Bishop the country was moving up. America does not want to see that. America wants these countries to be dependent on America all the time. There was no need to invade. The excuses were lame, stupid excuses that some Grenadians shamed, some African people shamed the rest of the people, of their brothers and sisters, by saying, oh, we thank God America came and saved us. They said that the people were suffering, the students there were having, the American medical students that were there in the medical school were having a bad time. When they were saying that at the time, those girls, those white American girls that are at the university there, were in bikinis, were in handkerchief-sized bikinis on the beach, playing about with some of the brothers and so on, having a good time, drinking and cavorting. They said, what's this all about? What's this thing that we're in danger? The brothers were more in danger from them than they were, I can tell you that. They always are. And so, what was the danger? There was no danger. The other point, the airport. The airport was being built. You remember what that cowboy said? It was missiles and so on, and all this thing he was saying. And Grenada does not need such a big airport. Doesn't need that. This is what this buffoon said. And what happened? When, after the invasion, what did they? They killed people. They bombed a mental hospital. People were going out naked. They didn't know what it was about. And they, fancy, doing that to the country. And what he goes and does, the same airport that was too big, too long, too everything, he goes and gives American aid and they build that airport for Grenada. And the height of really shame is that airport is now called the Ronald Reagan International Airport. Yeah. Can you believe it? I told a Grenadian brother, don't ask me to come and see if I can't come on a boat or on a sloop or something. I'm not coming on no airport to land in that airport because I hated Reagan so much that something might happen in the plane that I'm going to land in. I ain't coming there by plane. Ronald Reagan, and they got Reagan to go down and bless them to open the airport. And he had so little shame that he went down there and at the opening ceremony. That is what they mean by dominance, the dominance of our people. When they talk about the dominance of the third world, of countries over the third world, what they are saying is that they themselves intend to exert this dominance on a permanent basis. This dominance, it tells me that it refers to unequal relations existing between the developed capitalist countries and the countries of Africa and the Caribbean. That is what unequal relations. So the relations between the third world that they created and the first world is an unequal one economically, politically, constitutionally, educationally. It's an unequal one. And as long as there's a third world, there will always be an unequal relationship with the first world. In other words, with the world of Europe. Always. So this is something that we must remove from our thinking, remove from our vocabulary, remove totally, if we want to create a new society that is African. We have to remove that. Because the third world is not our creation. It was theirs. And it conjures up things that are nasty and bad. And within this relation that I'm talking about, economic, political, and culturally, in fact, what has happened, it has affected our cultures.
Yes, sir.
The European false, superficial culture has come in, and in Africa and in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and has caused, again, our cultures to literally go underground almost. The fact of life, the presence of life, the presence of living is always a European one. I'll bring it with language. In countries in the Caribbean where they speak a Creole, you cannot go to school and pass any exam in Creole. If you're in an English-speaking country, you got to pass that exam in English. Your papers have to be corrected in England. If you're in a French country, you have to do it in French. A French colony then. The same thing with the Spanish. You know their national languages in the Hispanic areas is Spanish. So again, that in self shuts the door on our culture and makes our culture go underground. Even the religions of Africa have to operate. Not a lot of people do practice it, Santeria and so on, but it's not openly practiced like, say, the house of God, the church of God, born again, redemptorist, all of that. They have all these little places all over the Caribbean. All these people that are here, these sex perverts that they send to jail, those electronic priests and so on that they have here. They come down to the Caribbean and on Sundays, tomorrow is a field day. In one street where my brother lives, there's 3 of them. 3 different churches. And you see on the veranda in the morning, when I was down there the other day, the little children coming down with their bags, with their handbag, shopping bag. Their mothers give them food and cake, and they have nice little white socks on, and nice little shoes, and nice white dresses, and their hair done, combed. They put a lot of coconut oil, and it's well combed, and they're going to church. Now those kids are going there from 8 o'clock in the morning. They're going to go back at 6 o'clock at night to their walk back to where they came from in the dark. And they're singing hymns, hallelujah, all kinds of hymns are going on, clapping and beating of tambourines. I don't hear any drums in those places. And that goes on every Sunday. Now when their mothers and fathers go home, that's not enough. They turn on the television set to watch when he was popular, Swaggart and all those other people. And they sit down there, with my brother's wife. She tells me that I notice on Sunday, every time this is coming on, you take the car and you go down to the beach and you stay out all Sunday. And when you come back in the night, you just come back for a short while, you take a shower and you go out again. She said, why don't you sit down and get a little God inside of you? I said, no, the African gods are there. They won't allow the European God to come in. And she said, oh boy, I don't know what they'll do with you. Your brother is not like you. I said, that's why he's stupid. He's not like me. She said, don't call your brother stupid. He's not stupid. She sits down there and she takes all the shows. More than that, she got tapes. And she says, the only thing that hurts me is that I cannot send and ask a question from here. I said, why can't you? When they're taping it, you get on your telephone, and it's going to cost you some pence, but you get on your telephone and send a message and ask a question, from these fakes. I said, all of them fakes. Oh, you mustn't say that. I said, I say worse, but I won't say it to you because the language is very terrible, what I have to say about them. But that goes on in all the homes that you want to see. On a Sunday, the young brothers and so on, they jump in their cars and so on. They're not in this kind of business. But the majority of the people from about, say, 35 upwards are into that. Apart from the fact of going to the cathedral, going to the Church of England, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, going to the Methodist Church, they take religion on 24 hours on a Sunday. Like this is Lent now. Oh my God, the place is doing a thriving business, those churches. Monies, arms, and everything. And what do they get for it? Now, they get cast-off clothes from white people in the South and Missouri and so on. And you see those children wearing cast-off clothes. And they wouldn't wear my cast-off clothes, but they will wear cast-off. I said, who you know? The guy might have been a Klansman. What you talking about? You wearing his clothes, and his spirit, his evil spirit is in his pants. Still. They'll have, and then all those tin foods that America gives away, and all tin butter and things. All of that they send down there. On a Saturday, they go and collect tinfuls, all that kind of tin stuff that's full of cancer. They go and collect it, and they're eating that. They said, at least the church is good to us. You wouldn't give me that. I said, I'm you. Damn right I wouldn't give you that food. Because I don't want to give you cancer. I'll give you something else. You know. But you cannot, you really cannot tell. And the government encourages that. You know what? Because the government gets a little thing from them, and they usually back the government. And when they're campaigning with the partisans, they send money from head office or whatever in Nebraska, wherever the heck they are, and they do that. So it's something in the Caribbean that's going on that needs to be looked at very seriously, that kind of thing. But quite apart from that, I'm saying these are the things that cause the concept of third world to last. The other thing I spoke about, dominance. What about underdevelopment? That's a term that we should forget. We're not responsible for that. We should think in terms of development, because we are going to do the development. As I said, if we find ourselves in a position where we have to use their labor, be it skilled or otherwise, let us pay them, but they have no control over anything. Not before our people get the necessary labor that they should get. You're not going to take an American engineer before you take a white American engineer, before you take an African American engineer. You wouldn't. I would prefer not to do that. I wouldn't do that. This is what I'm talking about. Because we have skilled people there that can do it. They can do everything that they can do. We can do it, and many times better. So I'm saying, we have to start thinking in terms of dependence. Dependency comes again from what? From you, from us, individually and collectively. Don't think about underdependence, because that is a negative thought in your mind. We know that underdevelopment is there. We should be thinking of development. What we are going to do to remove the condition so that we can improve our countries and get the kind of countries that we want and be the people. Because underdevelopment refers to and what's more, in my mind, it refers to me, when I hear that, of a continuous super exploitation of our people. That is what it brings up in my mind. Super exploitation of people. People who are consumers. And people, if you're a consumer, you are at the beck and call of whatever price is put on it. Let me give it to you this way. Michael Manley said this some time ago, although he's changed now, and I'm very sorry the way he's gone now. But still, what I'm saying is the fact that you borrow money from the IMF. Every single country has borrowed money from the IMF. You got to pay them back. They can't even pay the principal. You pay the interest. Now, listen to this. They put stipulations in the IMF, guidelines. You have to follow these guidelines. If you have somebody in your government that is suspect, his politics is suspect, they will hint to you, why don't you get another government minister? Why don't you, this guy is, we have information that they will lie to you and tell you that. So you find some way of getting rid of the brother to get somebody else. And who are you going to put there? Somebody that is safe. But safe for who? Safe for the IMF, safe for the State Department. What is more, the equipment you have to use to work the land, the tractors or whatever you're getting, you have to buy from America. You got to buy it. And if you're going to build a big airport, you must make sure you have to give a guarantee, you'd sign on the contract, that so many engineers, top engineers at management level, are being employed from here. And always the top engineers are white. So in other words, the IMF money goes back to America and IMF countries. And so you do not gain anything. You can't buy. You could never say you're going to buy no tractor or nothing, or you could get in an engineer from Cuba. You're in serious trouble. The man will just take his papers, tear it up, and walk away, fly away. You have to. So the IMF has this super exploitation I'm talking about. You cannot even use the money as you see fit. Now what they're doing, it's even worse. When you get IMF money in the Caribbean as elsewhere, They send what they call people who audit your books, people who are there to see how the money is spent. And before the Minister of Finance signs the voucher, the IMF auditor has to sign it as well. So you cannot do anything against the wishes of the IMF. That's the way these people are getting money. And Manley himself said, we were talking some months and months last year, and he was telling me, you know, one of the things that hurts me is that generations of Jamaican children that are not yet born in the next century will be paying, will having to work and pay for this money that they never benefited from. I said, you mean never benefited? I said, you now are not benefiting from those. He says, what is the answer? And I jokingly told him, do what Fidel says, don't pay them back.
That's right.
You know, don't pay them because they owe enough money. You know, they owe these countries. Now, these are things seriously. So we have to look at these things seriously. We talked about underdevelopment. And in other words, we are super exploited by the dominating societies. And the dominating societies are from Europe and North America. We've talked about that. What else we're looking at? Let us look at dependency. How do we see dependency, a concept in the third world made up by them? Dependency is the kind of structure that they create so that you have to depend on them. Now what I was saying is that what I was saying again, they will tell you, like Reagan did, the Caribbean Initiative Basin Initiative, where certain Caribbean goods will come into America without having to pay this great big duty and tax that they pay. When you hear the sound, at the same time you're allowing them to come in without having those certain goods, little goods that's coming into America to be sold here in the American market. Now let me ask you this. The little things they make in the Caribbean, do you think America, one of the most highly manufacturing countries in the world, you think that's going to have any effect on the American economy? No. In return now, you have to allow them to send all their goods to you in the Caribbean to sell. And you know, America, one of the reasons America wants empire is because the domestic market is swamped with its goods. And America cannot depend. The United States, I don't like to use the word America with the United States. The United States, not any America at all. The United States has swamped its markets, its internal market. So it's got to send its goods outside to be sold. Otherwise, this economy would be shaken as it is now. So it has to be selling outside, selling cars everywhere, selling corned beef, selling whatever, everywhere in the world it has to be selling. And these countries, all the Latin American countries and the Caribbean, are merely markets for these goods. I don't know how many of you ever went to Jamaica during the time Siaga was in office to see the supermarkets in Kingston and elsewhere, chock full of food. And people were saying in Jamaica, you see that? Manly gone, look, our shelf full of food. They're not worrying what kind of food it is, you know, but the shelves are full of food. Now the shelves are empty. They don't know where to turn. But it's this kind of thing that we, in the countries that they designate the third world, we do not give thought to. And this question of dependency, the areas of dependency, I mean, food, for instance, is a serious thing, particularly food. And nowadays it's coming to the question of cars and things that are on the television sets. There is not one island, no matter how poor the people may be, they have television sets, VCR. I know a friend of mine who has a little 2-room house. And the man has a Magnavox that's nearly as big as the room. And you know, he plays and he has his VCR. And when he's playing his VCR, The whole yard sits down and watching that, you know, and he passes drinks and so on around, you know. It's like it's a community. I mean, I can see that part of it, you know, but I'm telling him, Oscar, man, you're showing the people the bad things, not to mention late at night, he has friends and he shows some very funny films on his VCR. I don't have to tell you, but he shows some very funny films on his VCR. And, but the thing is that these things have swamped. You go into a home now, it can be in the most rural of rural areas. There is a big fridge in the place that can hide, you know, it can hide a 6-foot man. Those fridges have all sorts of things. Washing machine, they're not satisfied. I said, man, you've been washing in the damn river all the time. Now you telling me you having washing machine. They have washing machines in the room. They have drying machine. They have everything that's going there. The best bed, everything. Now, all right, if you use your money from bananas on that, okay, that's fine. You're making it a little comfortable for yourself. But what I'm saying is to buy all those things, they are bought with foreign currency, American dollars. You are buying American commodities. They swamp the whole of the Caribbean. Now, I can see what you see here now on television at this moment. They're seeing it in the Caribbean. They're seeing the same thing. A thing that would surprise you. You think our people love soaps here? You should go down to the Caribbean. When I come in the house, my brother's house with Cynthia, this religious lady, a nice lady, but you know, she tells me during the time of soaps, she says, Ed, I can't talk to anybody, you know, the phone is off the hook and so on.
Oh, no.
And she can tell me all the names and what's been happening. She likes this one. I said, Cynthia, don't ask me, I don't know their names. The only thing I can tell you, I know a title called The Guiding Light. That's all I know. I don't know anything else. I can't tell you what's on there. She said, you mean to tell me you live in America and you don't know these things? I said, I don't. And she's not alone. When they meet for prayer meeting, like yesterday, Friday was prayer meeting, and they go up to a place called Calvary. It's called Calvary. There's a huge cross up there. If you pass, when you fly over the island, you see this huge cross. When you pass by ship, you see this huge cross. And they go to a little grotto there to pray. And they take up sandwiches, they take up tea, and those who like it take up a little thing to strengthen the tea, you know, the coffee and so on. They take up a little, you know. Before they can do that, they first of all, they gossip about all the sins that are happening there. Who's going with who? Whose wife don't know she's it? Whose husband don't know his wife has his best friend? Well, all of that go. They come up there to pray, you know. Then the next minute, when they finish praying, they're now going to talk about the soaps. They're talking about the soaps. And then after they finish talking and eat and so on, they start, Hail Mary, full of grace, you know. That's what they do on a Friday evening. You know, and she tells me, Ed, you know, we prayed for you. I said, please don't. Please don't. I said, why you have to pray for me? She said, because we know you know how you don't believe certain things. I said, I don't, because they're not true. And anyway, I'm saying, this is what? Dominance is a thing that has to be removed, because dominance depends, as long as we are in that category, we will always expect that the consumer things that we need, we have to get it from outside. That's another term, as far as we're concerned, that should be removed. That we are so dependent on that the indigenous governing class continues to have good relationship with countries like America, like Britain, and so on. So that they always feel that they will get financial handouts. They will never think of having a summit meeting to discuss the future of the Caribbean in the Caribbean. They just came back from Europe. And while they were in Europe, they were discussing with Britain and with France and the other countries, they were discussing when the European Economic Community comes into effect next year, what will be the position? They're asking these Europeans, what will be their condition, their position, when they form this big closed White House? I told the Prime Minister had come back while I was down in the island just after Carnival. She came back the second day of Carnival. So she met me, she buttonholed me, and you were talking to me. So I said, I hear you just came back from Europe. What were you doing there? She said, oh, I went to see the European Economic. I said, why should you go and see them? You have no right to go and see them. You have to see each other down here. I said, what you went to discuss? We went to ask them what their position. I said, I'm surprised that you don't go and ask these people what their position is. You have no position there. You make your agenda and have your agenda down here. What have we got to offer? You know what I turned around and said? I said to her, I know her very, very well. This is no exaggeration. I know her extremely well. I said, Eugenia, you should be ashamed to ask her, what have you got to offer? What have you been doing for 12 years in office? What have you been doing? You're now telling me, what have you got to offer? We have a lot to offer. But we're not standing on our feet like men and women. That's what we're not doing. And it is not only one island. All the islands have that tendency. They don't want to join together in a community to be able to solve the problem. They have ambassadors from everywhere. They have ambassadors from Taiwan. They have ambassadors from Korea. They have ambassadors from here. You think they have one African ambassador? No. They don't have one African ambassador in those islands. Not one. And you know, they talk about Pan-Africanism. I said the concept of Pan-Africanism took root too in the Caribbean with George Padmore and people like that and Henry Sylvester Williams. It took root there. What has happened to them? What has happened to this? C.L.R. James and these men, they must be turning in their graves to hear that, to see that. And they sincerely feel, this is what I'm talking about. The concept of the third world is not dead. They talk about this in the world system. They're prepared to keep themselves, these countries that have been designated third world, a phrase that I hate, they're prepared to keep themselves in what they describe as the world system. The world system is a capitalist one, is dominated by industrial development, commerce, science, and so on, of which the countries designated also the third world cannot play a part at the moment. There is one thing that has been done, and it has never been utilized. In the Caribbean, like Africa, there is a tremendous brain drain. We have, and here too in America, look at the men and women that we have who can handle computers, who can handle science, who can handle... We have people in the NASA program, we have astronauts, we have women of tremendous caliber working in those places. What are we doing with them? You know who they're benefiting? White America. That's who they're benefiting. When we live here and we have a computer whiz, which we have, who does he go and work for? IBM. Look, I'm not blaming. I'm saying the system is structured that seems to be the only alternative. Or AT&T or any of them. I went and gave a lecture last year at AT&T in New York. They sent a limo from, I should have known that was big headquarters. They sent a limo for me. They did. And when they said, I came and said, I felt my bell was ringing. And I came down, I said, yes. He said, I'm looking for Professor Scobie. I said, speaking. He said, I've been sent here for you. I said, I thought as a friend of, that was, you know, one of the guys that worked there was coming for me. I know a fellow that worked. I thought, he said, no, they've sent me to get you. Man has his hat a brother, a black brother, a brother. His hat and his thing, and he took me in the limo. I sat in the limo. I said, well, there's very few times. I may never have that opportunity again. Let me make myself comfortable. The man drove me right to the door. And what was worse, I went in, I met the big head man or whatever, and a few head people, naturally white. And then they said, well, you come and meet the people, go in 1 or 2 departments. So I went in and I spoke. I said, They said they were having a lunch afterwards. So I said, I wouldn't have a lunch. I'm a man that looks to go to, I know to sit and have a lunch, you're going to sit down and talk a lot of rubbish to people, and you ain't going to enjoy the food, you know. So they said there's a lunch prepared for you. So I said, I'm in trouble. So I was telling a brother who does, he goes to the First World all the time. Brian, you know Brian? Yeah. Brian is the one that had introduced me to this thing. I said to, Brian was there. I said, Brian, I'm going to be in trouble. He says, why, Professor? I said, Brian, you know what I say in the First World is precisely what I'm going to say here. Perhaps it will be worse, just for wickedness' sake. It's going to be worse. So Brian said to me, he said, Professor, just say what you got to say. And boy, I said what I had to say. I noticed a lot of red faces and what have you, but that gives me a nice thrill to see red faces. I love to see red faces because I know it's going home, you know. So when they were finished, a brother that was there dressed with his clothes and his belt tie and his nice, well-dressed, a tall brother, he comes from Harlem. He tells me, I'm going to take you to show you the department where I work. So I go with him before we're going to lunch, and he's going to take me to the toilet to wash my hands and all that kind of business. So he's taking me around. So he takes me to this department, and this department, there's a lot of white people in there. And so I, like a fool, turn around and tell him, so you're the only brother working in here then? Only the African brother working in here? He says, no, I'm the manager in here. I nearly fell when he told me that. He's the manager in there. So I said, well, maybe I'm talking to a Tom. But the guy said, no. He had got a book of poems that he'd written, and he gave me the book of poems. And the man is more militant, at least in his poetry, than Brother Al Sharpton is. I said, do they know about this? He said, yes, I've given out prayer. I have the book. And he wrote one on the First World too. But I say, you can never judge people when you watch them like that. Now this guy has a big position there. I said to him after, I hope you last there. So I must ask Brian when I see him today if the guy still works there, you know. I go for lunch, and one lunch, they have all sorts of things there. One beautiful room with pictures and carpets, and I said, that's alone going to put me off my food. You know, anyway, I stayed in there and I ate, and those white people, you know, they like to ask questions. But what I'm saying, now this brother was telling me, a lot of our young people that come from colleges and so on, they're taken and they give them training. So when they give them training, it means they are lost for any other. So they are in there. And he says that is happening all over America. And so that led me to think, you see this thing, we talk about, we have people at colleges universities have been open for them, true. But we're not going to benefit by them. Because it's a difficult thing for a young person to want to make up his mind to leave, to go to Nigeria, to do this kind of work. I am not finding fault with them. I'm just saying it's a difficult decision to make. You know, you have to think of a lot of things. So I'm saying the same thing. You know what? A Ghanaian brother was telling me. He is a Ghanaian businessman, and he works in working in this. Again, he has to do with computers. He says, I know there are a lot of Ghanaians here in New York. We want them to come back to work down there. They won't come back. They say the money is not enough. And I said, well, what are they doing here? He says, a lot of them, they're driving taxis around Harlem. You know. I said, well, he's driving taxis to make up his money. Some fellows were still going to, but they prefer to do that. Then go back to Ghana and so on, and But this is what we have all over. The Caribbean is no different. The Caribbean is the same thing. This third world dependency, it is still there, and there is a reason for it. Because I know people who go back as doctors to the Caribbean and as engineers, in the engineering departments and so on. When they have any big project to work on, like there's a big sort of project with bridges and to dredge rivers and so on, they get American equipment. They're getting it for next to nothing. They have IMF money. They're getting paid. Now they get American engineers who are supposed to be experienced to come down there and be the head of the work, while these young engineers from Jamaica, Dominica, wherever, are their juniors. And what is worse, they're giving these American engineers the pay that they were getting in America, which is not chicken feed, those white engineers. And they're paying the young Caribbean, the African Caribbean engineers, the wages they give them there, which is chicken feed. I can tell you that. It's not fair. And who does the dirty work? The young brothers are doing all the dirty work. And these fellas get the benefits. And it's the same thing with building. You look at it in every way you want to look at it. This is happening. This, again, is a third world condition that we're talking about. This kind of dependency I was telling you about. And it's the kind of thing that you have will always, this kind of world system, this kind of attitude, this kind of situation that we have is brought about by the system, the world system. What is the world system? Monopoly capitalism. Monopoly capitalism. So this system makes it in such a way that the dependency syndrome will always be there. I explained to you what happened with Grenada. When Grenada was attacked, Grenada was the one country doing very well. Yes. And yet they were attacked because the United States did not want, they do not want any of the countries to get anywhere, to progress without their control and their help. The more we look at it in those countries that they call the third world, that are not really any world of our making, it's a world of their making, a world of dominance made by, quote unquote, the first world developed people. What happens when any of these Caribbean countries or any of the countries in the Americas, apart from the United States, want to become members of any organization, whether it's a United Nations or whatever organization, they join these organizations for one reason. Take one of them, the OAS, the Organization of American States. Every little country in the Caribbean has joined the OAS. Why have they joined it? Because as you become a member, you're given money, a loan. So all of the countries join, Barbados, Dominica, Trinidad, you name them, because of that. And what is more, they give scholarships to the young people, our young people. They give you scholarships to do certain things, but you always watch. It's scholarships to go where they want you to go and where they want you to study. And they have internships and all that kind of thing. So we in the Caribbean think, as African people, our people are getting something, but what we are getting in those terms, it's chicken feed compared to what the condition of the United States in the Americas. The United States has visioned itself as a dominating country in this hemisphere. For military reasons, for strategic reasons, for trade reasons, for everything. It has decided that it must have an empire here. And now, being that it stands almost alone in its might, its eyes have turned to the rest of the world. And consequently, it's going to be difficult for countries in the Caribbean and African countries to be able to have the kind of men and women who will be strong enough to remove this dependency syndrome of the third world. It's a thing that's going to last until we people of those areas allow it to last. Because it's a thing that was created by the first world people, if there's such a thing as the first world. And the other thing I want is the capitalism, the kind of capitalism I'm talking about. I am not necessarily making out a case for Marxism. Please get this straight. I'm making out a case for a system that is going to utilize some indigenous qualities. Frantz Fanon said, and Fanon was right, he said that it is about time we stopped imitating Europe. We stopped imitating and building institutions like Europe. Every generation has its role to play. In the countries they so wickedly call the third world countries, we must create for ourselves. We must build for ourselves. But we must also go back and look at the indigenous qualities that are there that we have never made use of before. We have never really made use of our brain, unless that brain has been trained by them. We do not accept our brain unless it is trained by them. So I cannot say, as Fanon says, I cannot say that we use our natural intelligence. And everyone is endowed with natural intelligence. But that natural intelligence on its own cannot, will not do. It has skills that you get and you learn. We really have not done that. If you look at the governments of the Caribbean, they are all fashioned on Europe style of government. None of them are fashioned with the kind of government of the people, the kind of things that people require. The people themselves at the grassroots level are saying that the politics of the Caribbean has to be motivated by the will of the people. Government must not use the will of the people to bend it. They must not be allowed to do that. The people must have a say in all that is being done in the Caribbean. This guy knew that. Maurice Bishop knew that. And he entered into a position of self-help, utilizing everybody. Again, the United States was wicked and evil and smart. They pushed the CIA there to cause destruction. And they got members of the Central Executive fighting with other members, with the result, you know the result, we don't need to go into it. And it is this kind of qualities that we have not examined when we're talking about the third world. We're talking about these countries. And I won't go further into this, but what I'm saying is this, to come to a conclusion, is that we look at this question of the third world, and the same dynamic that motivated the removal of colonialism in the period when the countries were seeking independence, both in Africa and elsewhere. We have allowed ourselves to stand there. Curiously enough, honestly, nothing seems to have happened since independence. What have we done? We have created governments in which we have African black ministers, and that's about it. They have not taken the system, lifted it up, thrown it away and examined it. They have carried on business as usual. That's the fault that has happened. They have none of them, and I don't know, I don't like to say it is too late, but it may be even too late now to get minds that have been conditioned to think like third world colonial peoples to want to change. They would want to stay, as all of them have stayed, in a neo-colonialist state. Neo-colonialism is as bad and as detrimental as colonialism was. Any form of colonialism is bad. And this is something that we have to face. That is why I said to the Prime Minister, you have no right to be going to Europe to ask Europe what's going to happen to us when the European economic community comes in being. And you know what she wrote in the paper, that was written in the papers when some of the local guys interviewed her? You know what she said? If we cannot get subsidies for our bananas, which is the main product, not only in one country, but in all those little islands in the Caribbean, they live by bananas, subsidized by Britain. And you know what the lady said? If we cannot get that, we face absolute ruin. These are exact words. I cannot accept that. Nobody has said anything about it. What it means, Britain cannot give you an undertaking that is going to subsidize your bananas. Britain belongs to a family of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 countries. Britain may say yes, but the other countries are not going to. France is not going to say yes. Germany, West Germany is not going to say yes. And those other countries are not going to say yes. So what's going to happen? They're going to turn it down. So I told her, I said, don't wait until I do something about it now. Do something about it. She said, I said, look, you've wasted a lot of time. You have never tried for us to do business with each other. We have never tried to sell to each other, to pool our commodities as a region. We have never tried that. We say the language barrier messes us up. It didn't mess no Columbus. The man came there and in 2 days he was telling Isabella what these people are, what kind of thing they speak. The man didn't know a blasted thing, big liar that he was. And he could tell Isabella and Ferdinand what these people were, who they were, what they were doing, their art, their culture, their everything. And we've been here 500 years and we're saying language is a barrier. It's the fault of the government again. You live in the Caribbean and you want to tell me that you only speak the language of the conqueror? The English people speak British, speak English. What about the other places there? We don't exchange students. We don't send our students to learn different. We don't teach these things, our students. A Caribbean people come here quicker than they'll go from an island to an island. They will. I know many women in the island of Dominica have never been to the capital, but they've been to Brooklyn. They've been to Brooklyn. I know people say, have you been to Antigua? What are you going to Antigua for? I'm going to see my child in Brooklyn. And so it is. What I'm saying is that, again, I notice Dr. J likes to use it, Gary likes to use it, and I'll say that again. The answer is in our own hands. We do not have let me end with we do not have the spirit of Garvey anymore. We had men who called themselves Pan-Africanists. Today, Pan-Africanism is totally lost. If we had that spirit today that these men had, C.L. James, Leon Damas, George Padmore, if we had that spirit today, we would be able to do something together. And this is the kind of spirit that I'm talking about. Let me read one short verse of what I'm saying here. It is written by, that poem is written by Aimé Césaire, who is still alive. He's 85 years, but he's still alive. He's one of the great Pan-Africanists. In fact, he taught Fanon. He was the principal of a school in Martinique where Fanon comes from, and Césaire taught Fanon at that school. It was a good pupil he had. And Césaire wrote a poem on going back home, returning back to self, finding self and returning self. And this is what he said. This is the spirit that we need today. And this is what he wrote, just one short verse. Listen to the white world, horribly tired from its immense effort. Hear its rebellious joints, cracking under the hard stars, its blue steel stiffness piercing the mystical flesh. Hear its victories trumpeting its defeats. Hear its miserable stumbling accompanied by grandiose alibis. Pity for our conquerors, omniscient and naive. Europe, I give my support to all that powders the sky with its insolence, to all that is loyal and fraternal, to all that has the courage to be eternally new, to all that can give its heart to fire, to all that has the strength to burst from an inexhaustibly sap, to all that is calm and sure, to all that is not you. Europe, pompous name for excrement. Thank you, brothers and sisters. Thank you, my brothers and sisters.
The archives is huge. It's 30,000 hours. Help me digitize it, organize it, and save it for African people.
Welcome to Dialogues in African and African American History. This is Adjoa Cheryl Sterling, and today we are interviewing Professor Edward Scobie, a noted African Studies scholar. We will be discussing the African slave trade in our conversation today. I'd like to welcome Professor Scobie to our show. Welcome, Professor Scobie.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here.
Mm-hmm. Professor Scobie, before we actually launch into the discussion on the slave trade, I'd like to start with an overview of the European and African interaction.
Long before the slave trade, long before the sort of first 500 years, beginning with Columbus and the other navigators of the period, there had been contact between Europe and Africa. In fact, the very first contact was made through Africa. It wasn't, Europeans did not sort of go navigate to Africa to find Africa. Africa had already been there, and all the history that came about at the time, earliest times, came about from Africa, from Ethiopia, Egypt, and North Africa, the rest of North Africa, all the way going through the Mediterranean. It was the African contact. Africans left Africa and went to Europe, not as people who were going to take lands and colonize lands, but they went there and they stayed for centuries. In fact, the very first big migration one can talk about at that time would be the migration of the Moors from North Africa that went there about 711 AD and stayed in Spain and Portugal and went through the whole of Europe, bringing their knowledge, bringing their science, bringing everything. And in fact, were it not for the Moors, there would be the expansion of Europe would not have taken place at the time. It was the Moors that were distinctly responsible for spreading the science of navigation that caused Portugal, before Spain even, to be able to cross vast areas of the sea using the instruments that the Moors had perfected in first Portugal and then Spain. This is not very well known, or scholars don't come up, particularly European scholars, they don't bring that to the fore. But this is something that is very, very, very well known among scholars today, among African scholars today. And when we talk about the Moors, people like to think that the Moors, we're talking about people, Arabic people, but that's not so. Let me give you some definition of the Moors. One of the very first definitions that came about was by an African who was called Leo Africanus, and a book that he published first in Italian and then in English in 1600. That's going way back. This is how he describes the Moors. And I'm quoting him from his Geographical History of Africa. he says, for all the Negroes or black Moors are descendants of Cush, the son of Ham, who was the son of Noah. But whatever difference there is between the Negroes and the tawny Moors, it is a fact that they are all of the same ancestry, and that is African. There is no doubt about it. And others have gone further and described them whom the Moors were. For instance, Chancellor Williams, in his book, he says he asks who are the Moors, and then he answers his own question. He says, now again, just who are the Moors? The answer is very easy, and I'm quoting Chancellor Williams. The original Moors, like the original Egyptians, were black Africans. As amalgamation became more and more widespread, only the Berbers, Arabs, and Coloreds in the Moroccan territories were called Moors, while the darkest and black-skinned Africans were called black Amors. Eventually, black was dropped from blackamoor. In North Africa and Morocco, in particular, all Muslim Arabs, mixed breeds, and Berbers are readily regarded as Moors. The black Africans, having had even this name taken from them, must contend for recognition as Moors. And that is why there has been a lot of contention. There's no contention. The Moors were African peoples primarily. There was a certain amount of miscegenation with the Arabs and so on, and later on they came into different colors, from black almost to near white, as we have in the world today, in the Western world today. You have African peoples that are of all different shades of color, going almost to white. So this is the kind of thing that happened when the Arabs conquered Africa. And another scholar, he's a great big Ghanaian scholar, Dr. De Graaf Johnson, and he wrote a book called African Glory, and he calls it the story of a vanished civilization. And here is what he says again, to use another scholar to be able to bring credence to what I'm telling you here. It was because the conquering army in Spain was largely made up of Africans from Morocco that we hear such phrases as the Moorish invasion of Spain, and why Shakespeare's hero Othello is a Moor, and why the word blackamoor exists in the English language, a word which leaves no doubt as to the color of the army of occupation in Spain and Portugal. In 711, the conquering army that took over Spain and Portugal were Africans, the Moors. And they remained there from 711 right up until 1492. That's almost 9 centuries they remained. And that is why Spain and Portugal and Italy and Sicily, the people there they have this kind of shades of color. I mean, I myself witnessed that when I visited Spain and when I visited Portugal. I was explaining, I've had some experiences of people who claim descendants of Moors, and they look like you and look like me. In fact, they were surprised to think that I would think that they were not, that they came there. Some people in Spain and Portugal, they come from Angola. Their parents and so on come from Angola. But a lot of them, there's a section in Portugal, for instance, that I visited a lot. And in Lisbon, the Moors used to call Lisbon La Esbuna, and it's on top of the hill overlooking the city. And that's where most of the Moorish descendants are. And I took pictures of them, I wrote stories, and the Moorish, they look like you, they look like me, they look like Reverend Brown, and it didn't surprise me. All throughout Portugal, I was so taken aback with this kind of revelation that when I went back to England, I had gone there doing research. I wrote a story called Africa in Portugal. It amazed me so much how African Portugal was, and Spain the same thing. Not only the people, the kind of style of life, the ways of life, their habits, and the whole thing amazed me. And so, not only in Africa, the Moors invaded lots of Europe. They went as far up as the Hebrides in Scotland, in England, and they had colonies right up into the 10th century AD. There were colonies of Moors who conquered and who lived on those areas near the sea, both in going down to Wales, going down to Ireland. That's a lot of, you find a lot of these people are darkish, they're dark-haired and they're swarthy-ish, all the way down to Devon and Cornwall in England, going all the way through France. In fact, up to now, there's an area in France, in southern France, called Petite Afrique. They still call it Petite Afrique because it was it was where the Moors settled in great numbers. And the people there, you see it. I mean, the people are like, like you and I. And I mean, the same thing in Italy, the same thing in Sicily. The Teutons and others that came down, they began to get mixed. I'm not saying that they're not Spanish people and Portuguese people who, with this mixture, who look like Scandinavians, that they're blue-eyed and blonde and so on. But the deep set, the people who really, the population is a vast numbers of people who are of Moorish descent, and they don't hide it. I had experiences myself in Lisbon that people who were Moors, and they didn't hide it. They were happy and proud to state that. So it's a fallacy to think that Portugal and Spain and these places are white in the sense of Anglo-Saxon or Celtic or what, because they're not. I mean, I had even an English friend. He had been a professor at Cambridge, and later on he became a producer with the British Broadcasting Corporation, where I worked for a while, and we were very friendly. And I can remember I used to joke with him. I would call him an Englishman. Dr. Tiller, you're an Englishman. He used to tell me, I'm not an Englishman, I'm a Cornishman. I used to tell him, well, what's the difference between Cornish? Cornwall is part of England. He said, when I tell you I'm a Cornishman, it means I'm telling you that I'm of Moorish descent. And I mean, there's some people who, when you go to, I have spent time in Cornwall and in Devon in the southern parts of England, and it didn't surprise me. There's some people that are darker than me. And one more story. I was saying a while ago that I was friendly with a photographer who worked for Time magazine and Life magazine. And Dr. Zinram, he came from Austria. And I used to go into his studio in Baker Street, which was near the BBC where I used to work. And I passed in there one day. I always passed, we would chat and have beers and so on. So I'd go to his home and listen to his music. And one day I went in there, and there was, in his studio, in his front room, there was a huge congregation of men there, sitting there. And so I came in, I called out to him. When I got up to him, and I said, hey man, it's your studio is full of people. What are they doing there? He said, they're doing there's an advertisement for the Daily Express magazine, the Lord Beaverbrook newspapers, and they're looking for someone to play the part of a Portuguese fisherman for one of the advertisements about fish in the paper. So I said, oh, it's interesting. He said, you can stay and watch this thing. So while I was with him, while they were interviewing, looking at these men and so on, which one they would take for thing, the men who were doing this thing, the guys, the managers or whatever you call them, the big shots, one said to me, Hugh, to me, he said, are you here for an interview? I said, no. Dr. Zrim said, no, he's my friend. He said, look, come into this office with me. So I came in, and to cut a long story short, they chose me as a Portuguese fisherman. So I said, but why? He said, they're Portuguese people like you, the men people and so on. And so I appeared in the Daily Express, the big things of Edward Scobie, black as a Portuguese fisherman. I wanted to say that it is the influence, not only the sort of physical and the physiognomy of the Portuguese and the Spanish that are in fact, I'm sorry, it's not only the looks, but the ways of life and the things that the Moors left there, their science, their learning, their navigation, all of these things were responsible for navigators to be able to cross the seas. The teachers at the time in Portugal, in Cordova, in Spain, in the other areas, they were Moors who taught. I mean, for instance, the teacher of Prince Henry the Navigator, they call him Prince Henry the Navigator, but he was Abul Hokel. He was a more from Morocco. He was from Morocco, and he was one of the teachers who taught Prince Henry the Navigator all that he knew, the drawing of the compasses and so on. All these things came from the Moors. So what I'm saying, it is the Moors that brought science and civilization to Spain and Portugal. I mean, it's not anything that is doubted anymore. Even going before that, I was telling you, it was Europe that, in fact, bended on its knees to accept the civilization of African civilization, if we want to use it in a broad sense, not the other way around. Listen to what was said in A History of the Modern World by Dr. R.R. Palmer of Princeton University and Dr. Joel Carlton of Duke University. This is a book that was published by Alfred Knopf here some years ago. And it's a history book. And the very beginning of this history book, and the very first chapter, it says, ancient times, before the Greeks. And listen to the very first paragraph of that book. And these two scholars they're great white American scholars. One's from Duke University, it's a big university, and Princeton, I don't have to tell you anymore. This was a book that it was used up to about 10 or 12 years ago, but for some unknown reason, with the rise of Africanization in scholarship, they pulled it out. The history department used to use it. And this book says I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, but let me read just a few sentences for you. Before the Greeks, Europeans were by no means the pioneers of human civilization. Half of man's recorded history had passed before anyone in Europe could read or write. The priests of Egypt began to keep written records between 4000 and 3000 BC. But more than 2,000 years later, the poems of Homer were still being circulated in the Greek city-states by word of mouth. Shortly after 3000 BC, while the pharaohs were building the first pyramids, Europeans were creating nothing more distinguished than huge garbage heaps. Ironically, like the pyramids, they still endure and are known to archaeologists as kitchen middens. I won't go further in this part, but this is European civilization is fifth down the line. There were many civilizations that predated that, and the main one was the civilization of Africa. And that is what the history of the world shows you. I mean, scholars, you can go into all sorts of scholars, even European scholars, you can go into that and you find that everywhere. I mean, going way back, you find that the scholars in those early days and scholars today. This question of Egypt and civilization of Africa came about only when the breakup of Africa as it was and the meeting with Europeans, particularly in the 14th and the 15th century, when the meeting began to take place, and then Columbus began to go on his enterprise. This is when the whole thing began to break up, and they said the growth of the modern world began with Columbus. But by that time, they began to institute, it was the slave trade and slavery that broke the complete picture that it was presented. And that picture was the picture that they put in its place was a picture of Africans who were on the fringes of civilization. They lived a kind of seduced twilight life, not knowing about themselves, what they had done, who they were, and so on. And that is totally untrue. There is absolutely no scholarship in any book or so that can backfire, except the scholarship of men who are racist. And you find more of that. This happened, even scholars who are white scholars tell you that, the genuine ones, tell you that it came from the South by a bunch of racists who still today carry on the same kind of thing. There is not an iota of truth in whatever they tell you about these things. It's the same thing they talk about education. There's absolutely nothing at all about that. If you give somebody an inferior education and you shoot them and lynch them and beat them to take it, you would produce people who think inferior. But if all of us, I mean, Africans and others, are capable of great thought and great achievement. Let nobody fool you. Racism cannot stop that. White supremacy could never stop that. And that is exactly what we're fighting at the turn of this century. All of these are vestiges of the slavery and the amalgamation and the meeting of Europe and Africa. What happened? Look, in 1492, the Moors eventually, when Spain began to join together, the kings and queen of Spain, began to join, Isabella and Ferdinand. That is when they managed to defeat the Moors and expel the Moors. And even so, what they left of the Moors, they couldn't destroy it. And they benefited by it. They talk about the Renaissance, the music, the art, the everything. Look at the buildings in Portugal. Fantastic. The Alhambra, and these were built by Africans. Fantastic. They had running water, they had hot and cold, they had conditioning, they had air, they had everything you could possibly want. You see those homes, those great things they talk about when you go and see the great architecture in Spain and in Portugal. The great bull rings they have, the Casa del Toros they have in Spain and Portugal. These things come from the Moors. It was the Moors that built them. It is not the Spanish people that came from, well, I don't want to say that because I don't want to sound in any kind of divisive way. But that's a fact. And these things are kept from me. Because you keep these things away, that does not mean that it isn't true. And they do it all the time. They do it here. It's a thing we know. I don't have to go into that. It's a thing that we all know. They hide things from you. They don't tell you the truth. And scholars expose it. Scholars who are really serious about their scholarship. Even the scholarship, even people like Bartholomew Las Casas, who was actually responsible for bringing after the Caribs and the Arawaks had been wiped out, and the Caribs that were not wiped out, those that remained, refused to be slaves. When he looked to Africa to get slaves, in the final, when Las Casas, the man who was close to Columbus, he found out Columbus was a cruel man. He began to have a hatred for Columbus. That Columbus wasn't as the great man that people thought. He exposed him in his writings. They didn't publish his work until very late after he died. One of the things he wrote in his will, this Franciscan priest, when he died, his paragraph in his will, his last will and testament, he was not blaming the Caribs and the Arawaks and the Africans. This is what he said in his will. At the end of a long life, Las Casas left us this somber prophecy and warning in his last will and testament. He said, these are the words of Las Casas in his will. You can read it in Spanish in anywhere. I believe that because of these impious, criminal, and ignominious acts perpetrated unjustly, tyrannously, and barbarously upon them, the Indians, God will visit his wrath and his ire upon Spain for her share, great or small, in the blood-stained riches obtained by theft and usurpation, accompanied by such slaughter and annihilation of these people, unless Spain does much to ask for penance. This is the last will and testament of a man who played a great part in being responsible for Africans coming here when the Arabs, the Caribs, and the Arawaks had been wiped out, and the Caribs fought them tooth and nail and would no longer be enslaved. This is what he wrote in his last will and testament. So this is no person teaching, no scholar teaching at the universities, unless they're scholars who's after the truth, after knowledge. Knowledge is a quest for the truth. Will tell you that, and it's there for you to see and for you to read.
Now, Professor Scobie, in light of the Moorish invasion and we should say civilization of Europe, and the European response, specifically, with Spain and Portugal, we know that they were the first voyagers to Africa. What do you think was their motivation in traveling to the African continent? Do you think it was just adventure, or they were looking for, let's see, the riches that their conquerors had? Or do you think they had some, other motivation, some, maybe revenge motivation, because after all, they had been occupied for hundreds of years by these people?
No, they were in quest for gold. That's what they were in quest for. It was an enterprise. Columbus, if you read Columbus's log and what he said, he called his journey, he called it an enterprise. In Spanish, he wrote, it is an enterprise looking for gold. He didn't expect to reach where he reached there, but still, the journey was the same for the gold. That is what they wanted. Europe was land poor, starved, and it didn't have the gold that Africa had. They began to know through the Moors and others. They knew that there was gold in Africa. Columbus himself had traveled to Africa before he had been. He had been on a ship. He wasn't the captain of any ship, but he was on a ship. On a ship that went to travel to the west coast of Africa. And he had met Moors, he had met Africans who had sailed, and he had conversational contact with them, and they had told him about these things. Most of the gold of the Moors and thing came from Africa. They knew this thing, and they knew this is where Spain, Portugal, Denmark, they all jumped into this thing to be able to get after the gold. And the first thing, that's why they came there as a lasting thing. They didn't come for any revenge. If they came for revenge, they would just come there, kill people, and run away. But they built forts all along the west coast of Africa, buildings that have lasted up to today. These buildings are there, the different slave forts. They wanted to get, that is where they were going to get, they wanted gold, they wanted ivory, and then they turned on to the human gold that they were getting, Africans that they were enslaved. That was the other gold that they had. So they were looking for gold itself. They were also looking for ivory, and then they had the people. When they began to have colonies in these countries, everywhere they went, it was after gold they were after. The Spanish came to the Caribbean. When they came there, the Spanish, they were looking for gold. Even Pizarro and the others that came there, Ponce de Leon, all of them came for gold. And the gold of the Indies, that was that built Spain up and made Spain and Portugal the countries that they were. Before any of the other countries in Europe, Spain and Portugal were well ahead in science, in education, in everything. The first universities in Granada, in Toledo, all these places had universities that had been set up not by Spanish, but by Moors, African Moors, Berbers, blacks, people who were black in color, black in complexion. These places were set, and they were tutored by these Africans. They were not tutored, as I say, by any Spanish, blonde Spanish at all, and gray-eyed Spanish. By Africans, they were tutored. Their whole education. And when they left, even their own scholars who write about Spain and Portugal at that period, they left, Spain went down. It became nothing almost, because there were only barbarians, thieves, footpads, vagrants who were around in Spain at the time. All the things that the Moors had left is one of the great scholars that wrote about Spain and Portugal. It's always good to quote, because when you quote, people know very well you're quoting one of them. You're not quoting necessarily only African scholars, but you're quoting their scholars, and they see for themselves what happened, what in fact happened. Let me just give you a short quotation that what this scholar said about Spain and Portugal. It's always good to have that kind of evidence with you, so you can bring it forth so people will understand very well what you're in. Oh yeah, there it is. The man who made this statement was an Englishman, a writer who made this statement about what happened to Spain. and Portugal. This writer was Lane Poole, that you probably, Stanley Lane Poole, The Story of the Moors in Spain. And this man said, he said here, how were the Moors compensated for their phenomenal contribution in civilizing Spain, Portugal, and other areas of Europe, steeped in barbarism and darkness? The 19th century scholar Stanley Lane Poole paints a picture of European savagery of the lowest form in their genocide of the Moors. 50,000 of them were brutally murdered on the famous Day of All Saints in 1570, when the honor of the apostles and the martyrs of Christendom was celebrated by the virtual martyrdom of these Moors. No less than 3 million Moors were banished by the first decade of the 17th century. They were sent to Holland, they were sent to Rotterdam, Amsterdam, to Hamburg. That is where they were sent. They were sent eventually, they were sent to the Caribbean. And it says here that, to use the words of the Franciscan priest Las Casas during the Columbian era, he said that when they did that to the Moors, Moloch must have been in disguise. In other words, the devil must have been in disguise in Spain when they were doing that. Spain and Portugal did not escape retribution. Where once wit and learning flourished, a general stagnation and degradation had fallen on their people and lands. Historians are agreed that they deserve their humiliation. Such is the terrible price that Spain and Portugal had to pay for their treatment of the Moors. As Stanley Lane Poole had concluded in his work, he said, they did not understand that they had killed their golden goose, unquote. This is what Spain went down. As I said, they talk about the Renaissance up to now, the music of the Renaissance, the art of the Renaissance. It was the Moors that was responsible. After that, Spain, these countries died out. You can see for yourself what happened to Spain and Portugal, and these places became lesser kingdoms. The kingdoms that grew at the time were France for a while until the Louis died out, and they were pushed out and they were executed during the French Revolution, and also in Britain. Britain is the last sort of remaining serious monarchy, and even so, you know, it is not on very good, strong legs at the moment, due to the sort of things that are happening in the family, in the royal, quote-unquote, family. So, however, I'm saying all the things that were done, the questions of civilization, the questions of scholarship, the question of science, the question of inventing of things, the Moors were the ones, the inventing of almost everything that went to Spain and Portugal came from these Africans. The reverse was true when Europeans invaded Africa and brought and colonized the Caribbean and North America with African peoples. They came there for the quest of gold. There is a scholar who said, a Spanish scholar who said that the Spanish would, and I don't know what he means, but he said it in Spanish. Translated, he says, the Spanish would rape the sun to get gold. This is his saying. The Spanish would rape the sun for gold at the time. And that's all they came for gold. The gold of the Indies, the gold of Hispaniola, the gold of the mainland countries of the Americas. That's what they were there for, to bring back to Seville and to bring back to Madrid and Barcelona, to make Spain what it was. They built all the great municipal buildings and great things you see. They all came out of the riches and of the African slave trade and African slavery. The same thing with France, the same thing with Denmark, the same thing when you go to France and in England. Even the banking system in England, people responsible for that is the slave trade and what they did to the slaves they owned, the amount of sugar cane that really caused the Industrial Revolution to grow. Were it not for the Industrial Revolution, Britain, and wait not for that, Britain would have been backward. All these countries would be backward. One of the great men, the great Englishman, he was the late Prime Minister of England, Sir Winston Churchill. He made a statement about talking about what the sugar meant and the Caribbean meant to Britain. and causing the Industrial Revolution to take place. Were it not for the sugar of these countries, Britain would have been backward, and the same thing would apply to France and to all the other countries. Today, when you look at the banks, if you go into, I was in Liverpool a few years ago, 2 years ago, I had gone to a conference in Liverpool. It was on the slave trade and slavery. And 12 of the main streets in Liverpool, in the commercial section of Liverpool, are named after men who profited from slavery and the slave, men who owned slaves, who owned plantations. All the banks, Midland banks, Barclays, all the banks there are by men who had begun in the slavery and the slave trade, and men who sold slaves and who got compensation when there was emancipation. And they started these banks. Most of these great big names today, their descendants, the Westminster Bank, all these things come from men who own plantations in the Caribbean. And so what I'm saying is that but for these men, and but for at the time, Britain and these countries would have been backward. And the hurtful thing about it is that the Caribbean and Africa never profited. Africa was as much involved in this thing as we were as the Africans that were sent to the Caribbean. Because while Africans were being enslaved and taken to the Caribbean and to the rest of the Americas, there were also missionaries who were taking lands and carving out every bit of land in Africa for Europeans. If you look at a map of Africa in the 1930s, you know what you're going to see? German East Africa, French West Africa, British West Africa. Why should there be British and German and Dutch West and West Africa? Why should that be? It shows you that these were the names of the conquerors who went there and conquered these places. And what do you think they conquered? Up to today, there is racism and there's white supremacy. They didn't go to Africa because they loved Africans. They went to Africa for the riches and the lands. They are still going there for the same purpose. The only people that don't seem to like Africa are Africans themselves in the Caribbean and in North America. Not everyone, but we're the only ones that don't seem to want to claim Africa as our ancestral home. And it's a sad thing.
Professor Scobie, we've covered a whole lot of different areas, but I want to be very specific with certain things for our viewers. Mm-hmm. How did we were first talking about the Europeans and their quest for gold. This is why they came to Africa. Yeah. And of course, we know, supposedly in history, Columbus discovered America in 1492. And then they went to the New World and they started to establish the colonies. And from there, we began the slave trade. But I want to talk about the motivation behind the slave trade in depth. Okay, we know it was the whole idea of wealth and prosperity. But why didn't they just rape the New World, I should say? Why didn't they just take everything and leave? What made them decide to stay? This is a viable place. And what motivated them later on to establish colonies and set up new establishments and societies there?
I think I touched very briefly on why. Mm-hmm. For instance, they had a very hard time after Columbus and all the way through Ponce de Leon and Bilbao and all of them. They had a rough time with the Caribs, the Taínos, and the Arawaks. They fought them for centuries. In fact, they met millions of Arawaks and Taínos and others. And by the time 1660 came, by the time they had conquered Jamaica, the Caribs were only a matter of hundreds of thousands left. And the Arawaks, by the 17th century, were almost totally wiped out. They would not do what the conquistadors wanted them to do. They would not seek for gold, they would not work in the mines, and they refused. And so the man who did that was Las Casas, who really said, well, look, they set about getting Africans to come. They couldn't bring Europeans here because they had tried indentured labor with Europeans who could not stand the intense climates in the Caribbean, who could not stand the intense climates here in the South, in Virginia, in Georgia, and these places. They got dysentery, they got malaria, they died, and so they were indentured. That is why Dr. Eric Williams said that slavery had three different colors at one time. It was white, it was red, and it was black. Africans were the ones that, in fact, were the ones that could withstand because they had led an outdoor life. They were farmers, they were planters, they were fishermen. They had led this kind of life, the life that was necessary to get to the Caribbean. It's not only that the Spanish didn't want to stay in the Caribbean initially, but when the British and the French and the Dutch began to come out here at that same time and saw what was happening, they wanted to remain. They wanted to cause colonies because Britain was an island. Britain is the British Isles are a set of islands, offshore islands of Europe, with absolutely nothing there. So to come out there, to come out to these places, take Africans as well. The British first began on a contract to sell slaves to Spain under the Asiento. They began to do that. And one of the great slave traders for the British at the time was the great Sir John Hawkins. And Sir John Hawkins had been given a title by Queen Elizabeth, and he was a great man who was leading the slave trade at the time. He was taking slaves and selling them to Spain in the Caribbean. But Britain itself saw the value, so they began to get into this thing themselves. The same thing that the Dutch began to do, the same thing that the French began to do. Everybody began to enter. By 1640, they had all entered into the slave trade, and slavery was a selling thing. And unfortunately, there was not all the nations of the world at the time were engaged in one trade, and they were in the trade of slavery, the slave trade and slavery. They were all engaged in that. Unfortunately, there were some African pundits, potentates, who got involved themselves, but they were not the beginners of that thing, but at a period of time, they were stopped by the chiefs themselves. They began to stop them from entering, and when they themselves saw the kind of horrible treatment that Africans were getting, their people were getting, they cut out of that. They stopped that because a few of the sons of chiefs and so on got caught, all Africans to Europeans, as they like to say, look alike. So they captured some of them. They captured some chiefs themselves. King Jajavo Popo was one that was enslaved, and they didn't like it, the conditions. That is why you see the drama of the Elizabethan period, the period of Queen Elizabeth and the period of Shakespeare. You find a lot of drama written at the time. The plays that were written were about rebellions, runaways, slaves that were fighting slavery. They were, all of them, and chiefs who were involved in this thing. A lot of the drama that was being shown in the West End of England, of London at the time, everywhere. This country was way back in drama, so we won't even count America at the time. But in England, where the drama, people would go to the drama and so on. And these are the things that we're going to see. These great epics of slaves who escaped, slaves who fought and who were leaders and so on. So they in turn, in the Caribbean, decided it was going to be a growing thing. And it was the money made out of sugar at that time, and also here, cotton, is that money that began to build up the riches of Europe, and particularly Britain and France and countries like that made them be able to have this, what they call the Industrial Revolution. Britain began to get industrialized, commercialized. Things where they began to have machines. They began to have things. The whole age was changing from a sort of landed gentry age into a commercial age where steam engines and things were coming at the time, brought about by the wealth that they made from the slave trade and slavery. So it was a lasting thing. They didn't come there to they came there to stay. They looked upon these countries in a different way, in the Caribbean and so on. They looked upon these countries as merely places where they would have their slave plantations, they would transport and ship all their things back to Britain, back to France, and their home was in England and France and so on. Not so here, because they began to send Europeans here, particularly at that time, Europeans who were felons, who had found the law, fallen foul of the law. The jails of England were overcrowded, were overburdened with English people in jail. So when they're talking about crime, I would wish that they would go into the statistics to show where crime came from, that the whole of the South, Virginia and Georgia, the Carolinas, were filled with felons who were taken from the jails of England and brought and settled there. So when people say they have when I hear white people talking about crime and they have a good background and good ancestry, they better be very careful. They might have a great-great-grandfather who was a sodomist or something. They better be very careful about that, because lots of the people that were taken, they were taken from England and other places and Germany and so on to come to the Americas, particularly in the South, not to return. They were not allowed to return to England. Many of the felons were all branded like slaves were branded, and they had a mark. When you were a felon, you had a mark. You had a mark on your body, so they knew you were a felon. You could not go back to England. You had to stay here. So most of the people that came there had to stay in this country. So what I'm saying is, in the Caribbean, they brought some felons and so on there. But you see, the thing that happened in the Caribbean, they had as much as twice or about 10 times as many Africans in the Caribbean as they had Europeans, because the Europeans did not look at the Caribbean as a place to build. They looked at the place, it was like a grand big factory where I would have my plantation, I'd have my townhouse, I would ship and transport this thing on the ships over to, I'd send them to Boston, to Salem, and to Newport News, and back to London, and back to Southampton, and back to Maine, and back to places, and Brussels and other places like that. So there were about, to every one European in the Caribbean at that time, there were 20 Africans. It was the ratio of the population was the exact opposite of the ratio here. So that is why you found in the Caribbean, and there were islands, most of the places were islands. That is why there were many, 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 many more successful slave revolts in the Caribbean than there were here. And the other thing too, slavery was slavery, but it had a different when I won't say complexion, but a different character to it. For instance, Africans who were enslaved by, say, the Spanish, they spoke Spanish, didn't they? Or they spoke a kind of Creole Spanish. So again, all the kind of way of life they had was part African and part the Spanish way of life. The Dutch was the same thing in the Dutch islands. The British were the same. The French, they all absorbed the sort of way of life that was imposed on them by the conqueror. In North America and the United States, when it became the United States, there was one conqueror. It was an Anglo-Saxon white conqueror from Britain, mainly. So the slavery had a more or less even and a similar sort of thing everywhere, whether it was in Georgia, whether it was in Alabama, whether it was in the Carolinas. But in the Caribbean, a slave coming from an island like Martinique that was French would have a different. He'd be a slave, he'd be an African, he was enslaved, but he'd speak a different language, for instance. He'd speak Creole, and that was a mixture of French and English, and some of the French and some of the African words he may still remember, whether they were Igbo words or whatever words, Wolof, but he would speak that in a new language that he was creating. On a British island, you had to speak the language of conquest was English. Same like the language of conquest in those French islands was French. So in other words, the Africans in different areas looked upon themselves in a different light, in the sense that I may be a slave, but and that is why you hear people talking about I'm French and I'm this and I'm that. It's because of the kind of experience they had during the slave conditions. Now these things are unraveling and they're not paying any attention to that as it should be. But that played a great part, because communication, the only way they could communicate with each other was through language. And when you did it through language, I mean, fancy you coming from Martinique and I'm coming from Antigua. I'm speaking English and you speaking a French Creole. If I don't understand the French Creole, we don't communicate. And this is one of the things that happened in the Caribbean. But there was one thing that was the same all over. The hatred of the slave master, the hatred of the slave condition, and all of them had the same sort of view, to escape from it. And it was easy, because the topography of the countries, Africans were more used to the topography of the rural topography. They knew what to do. They were the ones that knew where the places they could go and get away from. The English didn't know, the French didn't know, and that is why the French got such a terrible hiding in Haiti from the Africans that were there. It is not the troops, the Haitian troops, that beat the French. It was the people, the African people, of all 450,000 of them, that beat the French. Children were in the war, in that revolution. Women, grandmothers, everybody was in that war. Not only the soldiers who were fighting with Toussaint, Dessalines, but the people themselves, as a whole, fought in that war. And that's what defeated the French. Because you might have defeated an army in Abonite, in Haiti, in one section of Haiti. But if you went to a house and you asked for water, you didn't know if that water was poisoned. 10 to 1 the water was poisoned. And some nice granny would be giving you, here's the glass of water. But after you drank it, you wouldn't walk 2 steps. And so this is the kind of thing that happened. Our people fought, and the people could fight themselves. It wasn't a war only of soldiers. The British thought that, the French thought that, but it was the people that fought them. Over here, it was different. Africans were overpowered by a huge European plantocracy and population. And this, I'm not saying that they were not revolutions and revolts. There were recorded 250 revolts here. But they were more apt to succeed in the Caribbean where they did. They succeeded in many places, not only Haiti, many places. But the mistake that was made is that they never took, when they succeeded, they could have driven the French out, driven the English, and taken over the countries. Instead of that, they signed treaties and did business with them. That was the worst. The same thing happened in Brazil. The same thing happened with Zumbi. When they were very successful, they had some poor whites that came in and they were giving them, helping them and so on. And these were the ones that went and gave the news to the Portuguese and to the Brazilian troops and so on. And that's why the whole thing fell through. So, yes.
Oh, sorry. Can we cut for just a sec? Because what he just gave me, Dr. Scobie, you've been describing basically the whole philosophy of mercantilism and the triangular trade from Africa to America back to Europe. But I'd like to get into how this triangular trade advanced the European cause. It advanced their civilization. It advanced their power and their wealth. And conversely, how did it affect Africa? Because I would figure at one point in time when Africa and Europe first met, they were at an equal footing. And so now we see Africa at the lowest man of the totem pole. And this divergence occurred after the European and African connection. So could we address that for a moment?
Yes. It began to change in the 19th century. The conditions began to change. What was happening is that Europe at the conference, the Berlin Conference and the Brussels Conference in 1884, they began to partition off countries, sections of Africa for the different countries. 16 nations met in Berlin and in Brussels, and there was not one African. At that time, there were only a couple African countries that were really independent and free. Ethiopia was one of them. There were very few. At that time, they began to colonize. Not only they began to have armies and fight wars from those same slave forts that they built there. They began to have armies that were armies who remained there to fight different, what they called in those days, tribes. They began tribal warfare, and they began to partition off areas of the country. They not only stopped their trade, they began to have trade in palm oil, trade in precious metals, trade in oil, trade in everything. They began to commandeer this thing. And that is why the wars that were fought, the Akan Wars were fought. Wars in Africa were not fought in a weekend nor like the Gulf Wars. They were not fought for 4 years. These wars went on with the Zulus and others. These wars went on for years and years and years before they could conquer African countries. We must remember that. And they set out for that purpose because they are not only depending on sugar or tobacco, or just in their raw state, or cotton. They began with the Industrial Revolution. They began to manufacture, and they began to control the countries and colonize those countries that they had done business with. They began to colonize, and they got chiefs and others, heads of different units, wafs and all of that, to join forces with them. They were selling the goods that they were making in North America, in the United States when it became the United States, in Europe, in France. They were selling these goods. For instance, a simple thing: all the gold that was coming out of Africa, they were selling to Africans who were the home of gold and silver and platinum and so on. The whole of chains and beads and so on. They were selling cheap beads and things that, from here to Africans. Cheap things were being sold to Africa. The other thing is that they began to change their clothing, their clothes. For instance, the cotton industry. Cotton began to be an industry where cotton fabrics were being produced on a vast scale. And lots of Europeans were using white cotton and other cottons. There was no synthetic cloths at the time. It was mainly cotton, and that was it, and so on, and silk. They were selling these cotton things to people in Africa, building up their trade and business in cotton and all other goods that they were making. They were utilizing the labor, cheap labor, to do that. At the same time that they were taking control, they had taken control of these countries, colonial control. They colonized these countries, and they brought in their soldiers, they brought in their government agents, they brought in their governments, their civil service. They did a whole big job. And in other words, that is why they said, British West Africa, if you wanted a passport to leave Nigeria, it was a British passport you would get that would say British West Africa if you wanted to go to England. And the other thing they did too, they were educating, there were lots of chiefs and so on who sent their sons. They were educating Africans, not only through missionaries in Africa, in the different colonies that they had built in Africa, but they were educating them in England, in France, in areas like that. And what they were doing with a lot of them, they were teaching them to be teachers and priests. Durham University, for instance, had a close contact with university in Sierra Leone. All these chief's sons would go to Germany, they'd go to France. A chief, for instance, like Nyambana, the chief in Sierra Leone, he had 3 sons. He sent one to England, one to France, and one to Germany. Asked why he did that, he said he did that because he wanted his sons to bring back a bit of the culture of all these 3 countries, so his own people in Sierra Leone would benefit by it. They had Durham University would take young Africans and turn them into priests in Durham University from Sierra Leone, from Ghana, the Gold Coast as they called it at the time. And they would go back there preaching the word of God through a Christian word of God through the Anglican Church or the Church of England or whatever church it was. They were doing that, and it was a complete takeover. They were not only taking over of the businesses, taking over of the natural resources, taking over of the the finances to control it, and the mineral resources, but they were taking over of the minds of the people. Education in West and African countries, and education in the Caribbean was the same. For instance, the same exams and the same curriculum that they had in the grammar school in Dominica, where I came from, was the same curriculum they had at Oxford, Cambridge, London, wherever. And we were doing the same exams. Even that, I was going to the grammar school in the 30s, up into the late 30s when I was going to the grammar school. I knew everything about kings and queens and what they produced in Manchester and Liverpool and in the West Riding and in other. I knew everything about that, but I knew nothing. I would ask, well, what was happening in Dominica? What was happening in the Caribbean? What was happening? Was there only the wars by European countries fighting in the Caribbean Sea over the... I thought there was nothing happening. And that's in the 30s, the 1930s I'm talking about. And there are many, many, many people like me, many young boys and men and women today who went through that stage, and also in Nigeria. For instance, if I had a paper in Latin, for instance, I did Latin at school, a waste of time, but I did Latin. I had a paper in Latin, and I was going to do my senior school. I was going to do the upper school, which is the first part of the BA. I was going to do that, which I did. And what would happen? December was the time of exams over there. You have it in May and June, but it's December. In Britain, they were having the exams in December. The same paper, same questions that I was being asked in Latin. English boys and girls at secondary school or grammar schools, what you want to call them, were asked the same question. The ones in the Gold Coast were asked the same question. The ones in Nigeria were asked the same question. The ones in Sierra Leone. How they didn't identify those in the colonies, what they would do, they would give us index numbers. Where you came from, it was none. So I remember my index number was 7. And my name was given as 7, but the main paper, they knew who these people were. But when the examiners who were going to correct your papers got it, they didn't know if you were black, blue, pink, indigo, violet. It could have been an English paper, so they couldn't mark you in any way that you were a black person, you were a Caribbean, you were from the Caribbean. They didn't know that. You could be from Hartlepool in London, in England or someplace. So they couldn't sort of be prejudiced with your paper. So that is what was happening at the time. All of us had this identical education that they were having in England. That is why the Caribbean and lots of people in Africa identified with the mother country. They identified closely with it. And the same thing with the French, with people like Cézanne, Senghor, they identified with France. C'est la France, it was always la France. And the same thing with the British. I'm British to the core and that kind of nonsense we spoke about in those days. So consequently, colonization after slavery, the slave condition, made a total job of it. The entire economy was taken over. And goods were not developed and produced in Africa to feed and clothe Africans. They were produced in Europe, they were produced here. So the country had absolutely total dependence on the economy of Britain or the economy of France. They depended on France totally, like some countries still do. And that is why they are so developed and they sort of fell. They never could be themselves, taking care of themselves in the economy and their infrastructure. Development always had to come from England or from France. I remember very well, after one big kind of, not a hurricane, but there was a lot of rain and a lot of things, and there was a sort of a drift and a lot of mud and things covered the road, and people couldn't pass. There were trees on the road. And so they asked some people who lived around there and who would have to go to their gardens there. They asked them, well, the government said, well, why don't you help to remove the stones and the mud and all that on the road? And they answered as one person. They answered in Creole, but I'll tell you, they said, look, the road is not mine. The road belongs to the government. Let the government remove it. Every single thing depended on the British government or the French government or the Dutch government. And so it created a dependency. That is why up to today, those islands tell you they cannot feed themselves. They cannot clothe themselves. You hear my good friend Dr. John Henry Clark always saying, you can't even make a pin. We can't even produce, as it says, underclothes. He's always saying that when he has his little talks. And it's true, we don't produce anything. And what we produce there is for sale to the very same people who colonized us. The economy we were allowed to be too dependent on Britain and France and the others. And that is why development went down. When the British left and they began to desert these places, they left them high and dry. Up to now, the governments have to be going abroad when anything happens to try to borrow money. That is why the countries, not only in the Caribbean, but in Africa, they're so much indebted to the World Bank and countries like that. They're so much indebted to them, with the result that they're not producing anything. The things that they have, their tourism and these things really don't matter, to that extent. Because, tourism can be affected by the hurricane as it was last year. So I'm saying that is why while Europe moved up through development and through technology and science and so on, the Caribbean and Africa went down. Only the resources of Africa that was used, particularly the mineral and other resources, the oil resources and so on, that has been beneficial. But in any case, who controls those resources? Look at it again. Holland, France, Russia, England, these people control oil, they control everything in Africa. The Caribbean is the same thing. The selling of lands, the giving of prime lands, all the big hotels that are in the tourist countries of the Caribbean are hotels that belong to the big combines here and in Europe. So the Caribbean peoples do not own anything. They are selling. What is happening as a result of this continual dependency brought about through colonialism? We have turned ourselves into a consumer people. We're consuming, but we're not producing. Everybody has to consume, but people are also producing. They talk about in the Caribbean still, and again, it's that kind of monoculture ideology that we have, that we depend on one crop. It's from the slave heritage. In the days of slavery, the crop that everybody used in the Caribbean was sugar. Every island produced sugar, and to a certain extent, a certain amount of indigo and rice and tobacco, but not to that great extent. The big money-making thing was sugar. Who was making the money? Not Caribbean people, European peoples. And today, look at the economy of the Caribbean. It comes strictly out of that monoculture. When you talk about the Caribbean, two things come to your mind. Tourism in some of the countries that have the topography and the right kind of seas and beaches and so on for tourism. What's the next thing you hear? Bananas, right? All of them are producing bananas. And who are they selling the bananas to? The same huge combines, industrial combines that own these things during the slave period, and their descendants, they're selling to them. The bananas that remain in the Caribbean are what they call rejects they're not good enough. The quality and standard is not good enough to sell in Europe or to sell in New York and so on. So they sell it to the people. So actually, we are a people eating the rejects of the food that we sell. We're eating rejects. We don't produce clothes and shoes and so on any great scale. Food, we don't produce the food. We have the capacity to do it, but we don't. Even now, what you find happening, and this is a strictly hand-me-down from the days of slavery and colonialism. They want to start new industries. They were starting a shrimp industry in one of the islands. Who do you think they gave the chance to do it? I have nothing against people setting up businesses, and because of their ethnic background, I'm against them. They have Koreans in the island running, controlling the industry. Now, when you look at them in the islands, like I do, they don't hire outside people. They have their own people that are there controlling the business. They don't invest their money in the banks there. Their money is invested in their own banks away. They might give a little scholarship, or they might give some money for some little function, or a carnival queen. At this time of carnival, they give a little $500 or a little trip on American Airlines to come here, to go to Brooklyn to see their aunt, and to go down and get cosmetics and things that don't suit their face. And this is the kind of thing that they do. That's not good enough. The money goes out the same way the money would go out of the Caribbean to the Bank of England, to those places during the time of slavery. It's the same way the money is going to the Royal Bank of Canada, is going to Westminster Bank, is going to Citibank, and it's going all investments. Let me give you another instance that's straight out of the slave thing. There's a woman in one of the islands who controls the flower industry. That island produces beautiful flowers. You don't even have to, you just go into certain areas in the mountains and the valleys, and they produce lilies and other things that are beautiful. She came there, she retired as a teacher from Boston after having worked as a teacher in Boston for 40 years. She is European stock. She comes to the island on a visit, and then she loves the island, and she decides she's going to stay there. They give her all the necessary papers, so she stays there. She's there now. She's a citizen now. And she sees this flower thing. She begins to get into the flower business. And do you know, she controls the flower industry there. I have nothing against the person. What I'm saying, that the government 10 years ago had a chance of letting a few locals who wanted to do that. They didn't allow it. They allowed this woman to do that. Now, she is a rich woman. She told me herself, I talked to her. She said, you know, Ed, if I had known that this was like that, I had wasted 40 years teaching in Boston. I would have been a billionaire today if I had come here when I was young. That's the kind of thing that is happening still. All these things, again, they come out of the sort of the slave, the kind of mentality, dependency that we have from a slave condition where we depend on food, and the plantation owner would clothe, feed, and do everything to the slave. And this is the same thing, that kind of thing that operates. So what I'm saying is that it operated in Africa. You would be surprised. Again, I do not like to say these things to be divisive. I'm just saying, facing the truth. You do not know how deeply colonialism, depending on which country it is from Europe, has entered into the African, on the motherland of Africa. You would be surprised. And in the Caribbean, it's the same thing. Today, there's still a kind of love-hate relationship between colonizer and colonized. We are still, in a great sense, economically colonized. When we're talking about improving the economy of the Caribbean or the economy of Africa, we're looking outside of Africa. And when we look at outside of Africa, outside of Ghana, outside of Senegal, we're not looking at African Americans, you know. We're looking at Wall Street. That's what they're looking at. African leaders come here. They talk one kind of language uptown, past 96th Street, coming up to Harlem. When they hit Wall Street, it's a totally different language that they're talking. The language of money is what they're all about. They don't come up here on 125th Street to talk that to African brothers who are here. That kind of, it is not that there's any hatred or dislike, but it's just that the colonial dependency is still there. That is where it's at. And it is, we are, as Africans themselves, whether we're Africans in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, or in New York or in Georgia, but we allowed that to happen. We allowed it to happen. And we still look to them. That is why when I hear people saying that, the amount of money that we spend every year is 450 billion, Black African American people. That's a staggering figure. It's a figure that's higher than most of the countries, even some countries in Europe. And as for countries that are in the Caribbean and Africa, that money, what's happening to it? I mean, to give us a base. We don't need a base. We don't need a consumer base. We're just going to be left alone. If we're only consumers, we've got to control this thing. And that is one of the things that slavery destroyed, colonialism destroyed. M.S. Caesar said it in his book talking about his native land. He says, whenever colonialism exists, the indigenous root culture is in the process of being suffocated or strangled. When that happens, the person to whom it happens ceases to be what he or she was and becomes a carbon copy of something that does not suit him and is not geared to help him. In other words, he loses the mind that he should have. He's segregated his African mind and he's put a colonial mind there. And these two cannot exist together. It's either one or the other. And unfortunately, he was right, and we're still in that process. Frantz Fanon says the same thing. When he's talking about revolution and change, he's talking about the same thing. He says it is left to each generation has a duty to fulfill. He's talking about Africans in the vast sense, in the diasporic sense. Each generation has something to do. And that something is not to imitate Europe and her institutions, but to create, to invent something that comes out of his own roots. And that is his duty. If he cannot fulfill it, then he is an enemy in the struggle. That's as plain as day. It is true. Because it is no use how much success I have, or you have, or we have individually. We have a lot of success. We have a lot of brilliant people among our people from all levels. But it doesn't mean a thing if that can't be brought together to get a control in the corridors of power. We do not exist in the corridors of power except that we are hoovering the furs of the corridors of power. That is not good enough. People go, look at throughout the years that you've been watching, the United States goes to Africa on summit talks. It goes everywhere in the world of summit talks. How many times do you see a top African American who's born here who goes there in a capacity like a Secretary of State to give an indication and to give a direction about Africa? Never. We were talking the other day, about a few years ago, that people are saying, not in my lifetime, apartheid won't go in my lifetime. Apartheid has gone. It's true that where it's at the moment, there's a lot of work to be done. But at least, whether it's a paper man or what, but there's a paper leader of the African nation, South African nation today, if you want to call Mandela that. But at least they have to do business with him in the White House or in the State Department. We have African ambassadors. They don't listen to them. African ambassadors from here and from there. It is too long this has been happening. These are the things we need to look about, especially when we're talking about our economy. And whether people like to hear it or not, the state that we are in now is a distinct state that came out of the slave experience. You can say whatever you want. The slave experience was an experience of dependency. Today we have it to the fact. Even in ordinary things, look, every year in the month of June, every time a person picks up his newspaper on the morning of June the 10th in the Caribbean or in Africa, you know what he's looking for? To see if he's on the Queen's Honours List from Britain, and he's made a knight, or he's made an MB, a member of the British Empire. The British Empire doesn't even exist. They're waiting for this thing from the Queen. You have an MB or a GB, it doesn't mean you're a thing. The British Empire is something for Britain. It's no longer there. But they look up to that. They don't look up to themselves of what honors their country and their people can give them. They're looking at honors from the royalty. And royalty to this moment is not in a happy shape at the moment now, as you probably know. Read the papers and watch the television. You'll know that. These are the things we're still stuck up. Emulation. Following the patterns of others. A Frenchman once said, a French historian of the 18th century, he was talking at a convention in Paris, and he said, the Caribbean was created by the metropole. In other words, the countries, the big European countries of the world and so on. It was created by the metropole for the metropole. For the metropole. Do you need to hear any more? Still today, the goods we are trying to sell, our leaders, our political leaders, our chiefs of government, our prime ministers and our ministers go to Europe, they come down here, and they're asking to borrow money. I'm not saying you're coming for, like in the hurricane that hit the islands the other day. A lot of them came up asking for money. But that should not be the end of it at all. They should be able to be in a position to produce, the people themselves to generate this question of self-help. Garvey was on about self-help. When Garvey Garvey was not on a back to Africa. Garvey was on this thing. He built factories. He had all sorts of things. He had shipping lines. Garvey had everything. He said self-help is the most important thing. And we must learn to have that self-help for ourselves. Carlos Cook and all the others have been saying that. And up to now, we just say it. The action is not there to follow it up. And again, that comes from the dependency of slavery. When people come from the Caribbean, governments come here, they go to Europe, they go to Canada, they go everywhere. You know what I know, because I've lived in Europe, I've lived in Britain, so I know. They said, oh, there comes, in the BBC, they say, oh, there comes the Beggar's Opera again. There comes the Beggar's Opera. They're coming, their prime ministers, to beg for money. But what I'm saying is that we don't look to ourselves to do that. I can give you an instance that that hits me every year. Every year in the world, two things happen where Caribbean or black people are. You have Carnival in the Caribbean every year, and another thing you must expect every year is hurricanes in the Caribbean. You can link the two and make one, while one causes destruction and death, the other one can be there to help out. Look at Labor Day on Eastern Parkway. We talk about, you see what it had, the Million Men March, how much money it could produce. The Carnival on Eastern Parkway can do the same. They say that there were 2 million people. Can you imagine just talking to them about help for the hurricane? They'll pass baskets around. $1 from 2 million people on Eastern Parkway. $1. Well, you can't do anything with $1. In fact, nowadays, if you give a homeless man $1, he look at you and say, you need it more than I do. $1 can't buy you a roti. $1 can't take you on the train out of your home to come back. If you have $1, you have to walk. What can $1 buy? $1. Can you imagine what $2 million or close to $2 million would do if it was controlled properly to help build what the hurricane destroyed in the Caribbean? That would be that kind of money to help in the building of the Caribbean. And not only that, we do it every year. The carnivals in Canada, carnivals even in Austria today. There are carnivals everywhere. In France, in England, in Boston, everywhere there's a carnival going on. Every LIB, you notice that there are carnivals everywhere. What's wrong with giving scholarships or giving help or helping with homes or helping with homes for people, hospitals? What's wrong with that? Modern equipment for hospitals. What's wrong with that? Scholarships for young people, not only here in this country, but in the Caribbean. Why not this vast link? Why not? We're going to have a great big time I'm not saying you shouldn't have a good time on Eastern Parkway. But let's put it to something useful and something concrete. We separate culture from economics. The two are not separated. Politics, economics, and culture are all linked together, forming the civilization that we belong to. When we get that in our heads, then we'll be able to do something. But until then, we'll only be talking about it, the unity. Unity means putting your hand in pocket as a group of people and spending so much money to build something that is yours. The same thing, I see the papers, I'm not blaming them, they're making a big fuss about the new scheme of $330 million came into Harlem on this new scheme that they have there. Rangel brought it in, Yes, it's good to get that from the government, but what about self-help that Garvey was talking about, and he did? What about that? What about it? We don't have, this is necessary. This is the thing. That is how we can turn the tables from the kind of slave condition to a condition where we control our own destiny. The only way you can control your destiny is when you have the power and the money to do it. That's the way. It is necessary to do it. Because money can help in many ways. Particularly, we're talking about our youth and educating our youth and helping them. We're not talking about what they are talking about, building prisons to put our youth. That's the kind of future we can see that is positive. They have made an attempt, even the government has made an attempt to build more and more prisons. And more prisons are not supposed to stay empty. And they're not going to have predominantly Anglo-Saxon people in them. The people that they want to put in those prisons. Let us do something to stop it or to check the tide, to check the flow of this kind of thing. Because it's no use having children and saying, I want my child to be a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever, and then we do nothing about it. We don't even bother about their education. That is something that the slave condition did to us. And it's something that we have to completely put out of our minds and take. The new millennium must make us, for instance, remember the words of Du Bois about the color line and say there's not going to be any color line. There's going to be an African line where our people are going to meet on level ground. The playing field is going to be leveled, and we are going to make our playing field leveled for ourselves because we've been ignored for too long. And we're going to be ignored for another 100 years or 1,000 years in the next century. We're going to be ignored if we carry on like we've been carrying on so far. And that cannot be allowed to happen. Yeah?
Angela, are you tired? You need a break?
No, I can go on, since the steam is in me here.
I know Angela wants to bounce.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah. I'd like us to go into the beginnings of this dependent mentality of the slave, tracing the journey of our enslaved ancestors across the Middle Passage, their landing on the shores of this new world, and then being taken to this plantation and the experiences that they had to undergo from the seasoning process on, and how they were conditioned to fit into the society. For instance, I've read accounts of how after someone has landed, a slave has landed, and he's taken to the auction block, that basically how they were treated, they had to undergo an examination. Their mouths were opened and their teeth were examined to see if they were healthy. Even at certain times, their saliva was tasted. It was like they were licked by someone to taste how healthy the saliva was, so they could find out how healthy the slave was. So we're starting with a process of total humiliation.
Yeah.
And how now we have this very dependent mentality. So I'd like us to go through our history on that level.
What you say is exactly what happened, and sometimes worse. For instance, if you read the book of Oladawa Equiano, a book that an African, an Igbo, wrote in 1789, and it was published in England, and it was called The Interesting Narrative of the African, Oladawa Equiano, written by himself. And he was talking about what happened to him when he was captured as a boy of 10 years. He and his daughter were captured outside a little village where they lived in Benin, a place called Esaka. And he screamed and they burnt the village, and they took him and his sister to the coast. But his sister went one way and he went the other, and he never saw his sister again. But he describes what happened to him when he got on the ship. He wouldn't eat. And to force him to eat, they had all sorts of implements of quote unquote punishment, but they were really instruments of torture, sold in shops in New Boston, in New York, and so on in those days. And they would put this thing in his mouth and open the mouth. It would be inside his mouth, and they just did that, so your mouth had to open. Otherwise, they'd split it in two. They had this two thing they'd pull, and then your mouth is open. And when his mouth was opened, they would pour the food down in his mouth. And that is to make him, he wouldn't eat. And that's how they forced him to take victuals, as they call it, at that time. He refused to eat. And they would go through these kind of measures at the time. When you got on the plantation, for instance, when you got to the auction block, you went through the most utter humiliation. The humiliation of being, women had a half a thing on them and nothing else. And they were literally, the auctioneer would be saying the most repulsive things while he was touching and feeling, and this young 15-year-old girl, and he would be showing how you should have her because she's going to be a good handmaiden, and at the same time you can use her for whatever purpose you want. And he would say, look at how strong, look at her thighs, and he would slap her thighs, and all this thing was going on. And people would come, some people who didn't want to buy any African slaves, they would come there just to witness it, like you're going to a football game, and they'd come there to witness this thing, to see the spectacle. It was like a ball game you were going to, or a boxing match or something. And they would come on the docks to see, or it would take place on the docks, and they would sell this thing. Like, for instance, they once had a girl that they sold, and she was such a fine, as the auctioneer said, a fine physical specimen of a woman, that when they auctioned her, she fetched $1,475. At that time, we're talking about 1810. Can you imagine how much money that meant at the time? $1,475. And you know who bought her? A priest. An Anglican, a Church of England priest. He says he's going to convert and make a good Christian of her. And you know what he meant by he was making a good Christian of her. But this would happen all the time. But if you read slave reports from slaves themselves who managed to give their reports later on, those who escaped this thing, they were always angry. There was no slave, they tell you. I was reading Esteban's story about he was an escaped slave in Cuba. And he said there was no slave, no matter how much he pretended to be a fool and accept what his master did, enjoyed the condition of slavery. what he did, in other words, what he was saying is that even Uncle Toms would pretend, but it wasn't true. Because they hated, everyone hated the condition. And the thing about it too, I want to talk here. From the time that Africans were left the slave forts, wherever it was, in the fort the Christian, or any of those forts, and they got on the ship, on the high tide, and the ship was leaving the Bight of Benin. From the time the boat, there was howling and screaming and shouting when they saw through the hole, they would peep and see the shores of Africa disappearing. And that was the most dangerous time, because if they had them on the top deck, many of them, as you know the story, would jump alive to go back to Africa, because they felt that their spirit would go back. Up to in the Caribbean, I know up to my years, I know many, many elderly people who think when you're burying them, they insist, one of the things the people I know insist in being buried with their feet towards Africa. I can remember telling a woman, Ma Edward, I said, but how you know? When I was telling her, she was 98 years at the time. She is insisting that she wants to be buried with her feet towards. She says, because I'm going back to Africa. I said, but how you know where Africa is? She used to tell me, boy, don't ask me where Africa is. I know where Africa is. And she would point from the village, the sea. She lived on the seacoast. And where she was pointing was correct, when you're looking at the compass. I say, yeah. I said, Maya, but you're right. That is, Africa is right. And she said, don't tell me. I can smell when the breeze that is coming here is not coming from the islands. I can smell when it's coming from the Sahara. She could smell the difference. She could tell the difference in the breezes. And it's true. I thought she was just joking. The other day I was going down on a plane to Dominica. And when we hit Tortola and we were going down, I noticed the sky was looking sort of foggy, and so I said, this looks funny. And the ship, the pilot got out and said, all this sort of the haze you're seeing there, this is the dust from the Sahara Desert that is blowing. Yeah, I said, heck, right in the Caribbean, African, things are falling down on the sea and falling on the land. So in a sense, we're really not too far away so I knew what the elderly people were saying. But going back to this thing, the most dangerous Africans for their freedom coming across the Middle Passage, you know who they were? Women. They were the ones that challenged the crew at the time. They were the most dangerous ones. You know what they would do? Many of these sailors that they were put to guard them and so on, for disease and so on, they would give the sailors to drink rum. Rum was the thing was supposed to keep away, and in those days there were no injections and so on, so that they would want to keep out the flux and keep out this, so they would drink. So some of the sailors would imbibe a little too much, and by the time the captain was in his cabin, and that was what they would do. They would go down and try to get some of the African women together and a few of the sailors and bring them to the top where they were to do what. So they were full of rum. Some of the women, the young women, allowed them to do that. And when they got up into wherever the deck where they were hiding, then they would take the sailors' own knife and kill them and take the keys away from them and unlock themselves and unlock, and there would be a whole to-do going on, and they would dash at the other sailors there and chop them. These riots happened a lot. It's only the other day a book was written by a sister from the Caribbean. She teaches in the Caribbean, where this was exposed. African women were the one that led, and on the plantations too. In Barbados and the plantation, they said women were docile. They were not. They had to face two things. They had to face the hard work that their men were doing, and they had to face the viciousness and sexy things of these men, of the plantation owners and their sons and their daughters, because it is a known thing. It was written by Falconbridge, who was a doctor who went to the Caribbean at that time as a doctor, Alexander Falconbridge, and he said that 1 out of every 20 Europeans that went down to the Caribbean on plantations 19 would have African mistresses, whether they were married or single. The only one that would not have an African mistress was usually a Quaker. And after he had been there, because he was a Quaker and he wanted to keep to his religion, but after he was there 3 weeks or 6 weeks, he would begin to change. And he would succumb to this thing. And he himself would have a young African mistress. Because one of the things they gave these young Europeans when they came there, have your pick of one. Have your pick of one of the ladies. Have your pick of one of the slave women. They brought them there for that purpose. And there are some of them who even brought, unfortunately, it's in the book of some of the writers, they even brought young boys for those who had funny habits, for those Europeans who had funny habits. And they did have funny habits too. If you read the story of this thing, written by one of their own men, you would, I have it somewhere there, I didn't bring it out, but it would turn you'd make you cringe when you read what they were doing to, even their own writers said that they practiced the most terrible sexual vices and things on these poor young, innocent African women, girls and so on, and changed them. And some of these women succumbed, some, but and they did it for a purpose. And this is the kind of life that went on the plantation. In Barbados, I wish I had brought that book. It was published only the other day, and it's a new book written by a sister. Mm-hmm. And what happened is that they would give some young women, as many women worked on the plantation on the fields as men. Now they would give young African women that they were after, the young men, the sons and even the plantation owners themselves, they would put them to work certain patches of land, whether they were planting they were planting dashins or tanyas or yams, or they were cutting the stalks of cane plants. They would put them very far away, where they were almost hidden. And these young men, the sons or the foremen, would ride their horses to where these young women were, and there they would pick one. They would want to molest them there and then, and have sexual relations there. There was one girl, they were always after her. I can't remember the name, but she was aware of her attractiveness, and she utilized it as a weapon against them. And one of the man the driver of one of the gangs was after her, and he was a mean sort of man. And he was after her one morning and came to her and told her, "Come here." He says, "Come here." He got off his horse and stood near his horse under a big hidden thing of trees and told her to come here. She said, "No, you come to me." And she said, "How dare you?" She said, "You come to me." So he said, "All right," and he came to her. And when he came near her, with one swipe, she chopped his head off. And her other friends knew that this was going to happen, because there was a sort of telegraph. All of us knew what was happening, and the others ran to her and took her and saved, and they all escaped from the plantation. But that used to happen a lot. They never wrote about that, those kind of things, until the evidence is there. It was the same thing with all the revolutions and the riots that took place. They kept that hidden. They wanted to say that Africans were the ones who were abolitionists, got them out of slavery. They didn't do anything of the sort. The abolitionists only changed laws that they themselves their people had passed. The Africans who were enslaved all got away by themselves. When they couldn't control, the slave condition was faltering, was breaking down. When they couldn't control that anymore, that is when they began to say they were emancipating slaves. When they were forced to do it through these revolutions, not only Haiti, Jamaica, Dominica, all those are even the night before abolition, the last slave revolt in Barbados was the night before. That was in 1833, just before, a day before the abolitionists papers came through. They didn't even know that. And they fought. That was the last big revolution and riot they had. In Barbados, is supposed to be such a placid place. That's what happened. Every single island, everyone, and in the mainland countries like Brazil and so on, that was happening. That's what made the slave condition crumble. In Jamaica, it was the same thing. 9 months before emancipation, one of the biggest revolts was fought in December the 17th, 1832 in Jamaica. And they burned down 136 plantations and killed thousands of them. That's what forced these people to give. It was they didn't love any slaves. They didn't love those people. They were forced to do it. And the Africans that were on the Caribbean, they were the ones they tried to break in. But it was the most difficult thing to break in the people that were there, because they were that way inclined. It shows you through all the riots. And there were revolution in Jamaica alone. There was over 250. There were riots and revolutions all the time. For 35 years, Kojo fought them, and they fought them all the time. They were fighting them. In Dominica, it was the same thing. You don't hear those things because, I brought out some of them in my book. But you don't hear a lot about that because you're not going to expect Europeans to write about things that are successful by slavery. They don't do it. They don't do it at all. So what I'm saying is that the breaking of some of them, they would break them, and they would those that they fell in, they would send them to New Orleans, to some from Haiti, to Congo Square, and they would send them in New Orleans. But when they came to New Orleans, wherever they went, they spread this thing of revolution. What do you think, Gabriel Prost and the others, what do you think encouraged them a lot? They all spoke about it in their Gabriel Prost, Denmark BC, the Haitian Revolution. They were afraid of Haiti. Europeans here, Americans, Anglo-Americans were mortally afraid in New York, here, everywhere, about Haiti. What happened? What happened with Desalegn, and what happened with Christophe and Pétion and all of these people? They were mortally afraid of it, that it was going to happen here. And that's what hastened on the abolition, because Africans never took kindly to slavery. They never did. No matter, all of us have different approaches to life. Some of them would be more outspoken than others. Others would keep it to themselves. But deep down, let's take Tubman. When they asked Harriet Tubman to describe what slavery was, you know what she said? Slavery is the next thing to hell. I know, because I was a slave for 25 years of my life. The next thing to hell, she said. And she made up her mind that she was going to break away from that. And she did. She not only broke away, she came back many times and brought people back to their freedom and liberty. That's what it did with people. Alex Guma, who was a slave who was brought to be executed before a court, he said, why make a mockery? The same kind of thing that this man said, his walker's appeal. The same thing he said, why make a mockery of taking me? You want to kill me. He says, but with a slave, when a slave, an African slave, kills his master, he does an act of justice when he kills his master. Justice to himself and his people. And he said that in court. When he kills his master, he does an act of justice to himself and his people. That's what he said. They were not afraid to die. This is the kind of amazing thing. I mean, young women could fight. Young women could fight these people, fight these men, fight them, literally fight them. And the thing is the women would gang up together. That was another thing. Sisters would gang up together, and they were not afraid to face these people. They were not, even as they say, on board ship. They were already fighting this thing on board ship. They knew the circumstances, they knew what would happen, but yet they would fight it. This is a tremendous epic that we saw only bits and pieces of this thing in Sankofa and the other thing, but we haven't seen the full story of the great fight there was in this hemisphere against the slave condition. It's nothing to be ashamed of. As Kenneth Stamp said in his book, The Peculiar Institution, talking about slavery in the antebellum South, he said, the Negro has nothing to be, he's a white scholar, so at least he's an honest one. He said the Negro has nothing to be ashamed of in slavery. Those who should be ashamed is the South and the slave owner. These are the ones that have to be ashamed. The Negro has nothing to be ashamed of. It is they who have things to be ashamed of. And it's true. I always said that. I have nothing to be ashamed of. We have nothing to be ashamed of. They have the shame. But you see, they have it to such a terrible degree that they like to put all their nasty things on us. And we have all the vices. They talk about men, about jails and so on. They will never tell you the hundreds and thousands that were sent here from jails in Britain. Not black people, white people, sent to jails to Australia, everywhere they were sent. And they were the ones committing the most atrocious crimes that you can believe. And it doesn't surprise me. Seeing how the Klan and others behave has never surprised me, because I know there's a historical background for all of that. And we are not the ones responsible. They are responsible. Their own writers say it, but they will never produce. Can you imagine a European, an Anglo-American professor standing before a class mainly of Hispanic people and black people and saying those things about it? He can't do it. He can't do it. With all conscious to himself, he won't do it. He will try to put the blame on. That's what they're making it appear to the world, that it is African peoples that are creating all the things. It isn't. Crime is still a very white disease and not a black one. But you know what? You see the way they've gone about it. Dishonesty. One of the things that I've always remembered is something that Justice Leon Higginbotham wrote in his book In a Matter of Color. And he's talking about what the judicial system in America did to blacks. I like to quote him, but and his book is somewhere up there, you know. And I like to quote him in The Matter of Color. And what he says, you know, what it has done to millions and millions of black people who have suffered under the judicial system. They are still suffering under the judicial system. They're still suffering more than ever today. If you read Bruce Wright, is a great scholar, if you read his book, you will see the same thing. The judicial system is geared against. I was seen against this. I was reading, yes, today I bought a paper. I was downtown when I was coming up to show you how it hasn't changed. I bought this Express paper. It's the Beaverbrook paper from England. I bought it because I saw that, yes, that's in England. Police admit, yes, we do pick on the blacks. Look at it there.
Yeah.
Yes, we do pick on the blacks. The same thing they do here. It's the same thing they do in England and everywhere else. In Paris, it's the same thing. This racism is endemic all over Europe today more than anything else. It's happening. And yes,
I'd like to ask about how we've internalized that racism. Okay, this question of color, and going back again to this question of color and going back again to the slave plantation. You know, with all the sexual contact between the slave masters and the slave women, basically the raping of the women, was created within the slave system a class of mulattoes, or it's not just mulattoes. They had many gradations of color.
Right.
And I want to talk about how those different gradations of color within the plantation affected the psyche of the slave, and how that was used in ways to divide the slave plantation.
You're right, it was used a lot. they used laws, they used social patterns of behavior, all these things to divide blacks and people of different shades of color. It's very noticeable in Hispanic countries, even today. It's very noticeable in the Caribbean, not as much as it was before, but it's there. And the question of one of the biggest problems of Haiti, particularly, that's the one that comes to mind, but it has been a problem with Africans in the diaspora, whether they're here in New Orleans, in New York, or in the Trinidad or wherever, but it has been there. This question of shades of color, complexion, has always played. On the plantation in the Caribbean, one of the things the plantation owner said, if a plantation owner had an affair with an African woman, and she had a child, and that child was obviously a mulatto, the child would be lighter than the mother, 10-1. It's going to be lighter than the mother in color. The mother may have had a boyfriend, an African boyfriend on the plantation, Jack or whatever his name, and she may have had a child by this African boyfriend, and the child would be kind of darkish color, like mother and like father. She would have this mulatto child. This mulatto child would be taken out of her control totally by the plantation owner. They passed laws themselves to say that being a mulatto, being of white and black heritage, that child could not stand the rigors and do the rough work in the field like his brother who was black. So they didn't allow mulattoes to do field work. They would give mulatto children jobs, like what? To spy or to keep their eyes on the different gangs and run back and tell the father. They would allow that child to sleep in the big house, perhaps downstairs in one of the basement rooms. They would allow that child to work there in the kitchen and so on, and to play with his quote-unquote white brothers. But his white brothers could kick him or do anything to him, and he couldn't retaliate. He would be given food, not at the table, but when they were finished eating, he would sit in the pantry or in the kitchen, and he would eat from one of the plates. He'd eat food, he'd get food there. If the child loved his mother, he would take some food, pack it up in the thing, and bring it to his mother or his brothers in the cabins where they lived. Now that child had those privileges. Many of them, when they grew up, they were educated by their fathers. For instance, a plantation owner, may not have had children with his wife, and that would be the only son he had. And that boy, perhaps, would be a clever boy who understood the plantation and they allowed that child to get an education. Blacks children were not educated, but they would allow him to get a certain education. And depending on how good he was, they would send him to England, or they would send the daughter to England. They would send him to France, and they would give him Many of the mulattoes in Haiti had been educated in France. People like Vincent Auger, he was the son of a rich aristocrat, a duke. He was his final education in Paris, and he was a scholar. He came back, and he felt humiliated because they wouldn't allow him, for instance, he joined the army, and they wouldn't allow him to reach you couldn't be more than a captain in the army, whether you were brilliant or not. You couldn't reach major or lieutenant colonel or general, because he was a mulatto. And yet he would have a brother who was white, who was his father and mother, and yet that brother could reach the highest. And they couldn't sit in certain seats in the seats at the front of the church and so on. You'd have to sit in the middle or at the back. And the theater was the same thing, and the show. So they were treated in that fashion, even by the poor whites and the lesser whites, the ordinary shopkeepers and so on that were on the island at the time. And they resented it. And they fought their fathers about this. And at the same time, they always felt that they were superior to the blacks in Haiti. And that was a bone of, and this is what that destroyed Haiti. Not the fact they had won the war, but they lost the battle against themselves. There were very few Haitian mulattoes that really took sides. They used the blacks, they used their parents, they used their brothers, and when it came down to the final thing, they would betray them. They would betray them. And this is one of the things. They themselves, 12 of the richest plantations after their fathers died were owned by mulattoes. And they had slaves. They had, for instance, some of them had their own brothers working as heading the gangs and so on. But they had slaves. They were rich. And what they would do, they would go to France, go to Paris, marry a Parisian woman. And lots of the families they have there now, up to now, the descendants, that some of them that claim to be white, they come out of this kind of thing. And I know Haitians who scholars and friends and who I know, I have some Haitian friends who tell me, this business will never change, because mulattoes are prejudiced. They tell you préjugé. They're always telling you this kind of thing. I know what they mean by that because I speak Creole, so I understand. I know a person. She's a fine person. She's dark, but she happens to have very light children. She wouldn't want her daughters. She got 2 pretty daughters. She wouldn't want her daughters to marry a black Haitian. She wouldn't. And I mean, it is this kind of thing that still pervades in the society. There is no link between the two, because after the revolution, when Dessalines died and when Christophe died, there was a whole slew of Haitian presidents that were mulattoes. And they all joined forces with France. And France began to export things to Haiti. They began to have, they were calling Haiti at the time the Paris of the Antilles. The Paris of the Antilles. Many of their people, they would send their children to school. They wanted their daughters. I know, for instance, I used to play football against the island. I was an island footballer on my place. And I used to play against Martinique, and I had some Martinican friends who were mulattoes, one particularly family. That is a light-skinned family. But boy, they were prejudiced.